Welcome to Orthodox Christian Theology. This is Craig Trulia, and with today are two of my favorite guests. There's Evangelos Nikitopoulos, and we have Deacon Henok Elias. It's great to have both you guys on to talk about Ethiopian Orthodoxy. How are we doing today?
Doing well. Thanks for having us.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Now, it's such an interesting topic to talk about Ethiopian saints, because there's so many saints we have in common, and it's been a real treat for me to read the Ethiopian synaxarion, to read the book and translation of Saints and Lives of the Saints by Evangelos. We see there, Saints of Ethiopia. Link is below. It is a great book. It's not a long read. It's a good devotional before bed. I don't know. When do you guys read Saints' Lives? Mine is before bed. What's your guys' routine?
I tend usually, as a rule of thumb, to read before bed because I find I'm more relaxed and I'm more gathered. Whereas during the day, I have like other things on my mind. So, yeah, usually it's right before bed for me.
For me, my reading, and I know as a father, you can probably relate. It's gone down a lot, and so sometimes actually there's a Father Anthony Messa in the Coptic church. He's got an English parish in the greater DC area. He had this advice once that I took to heart, which is compel yourself to read 20 minutes a day. So in the evenings, I kind of compel myself, but I'm really worn out from work. I work at a Catholic school, and one of our things of our model is that we have extra hours. So I'm working like really long days. And so...
so you do the aftercare too for the kids.
Yeah, exactly. And a lot of my deep work is actually like on weekends. So after my post-liturgical nap on Sundays, when the coffee hits, or on Saturday mornings early before my son and my wife are awake.
There you go. And which is why this show is scheduled when it is. And I could very much relate as a parent. The whole routine changes, and based on the children's stage, you adjust what you get done and when you get it done. I'm hoping to reach a evening devotional with the whole family where you have the Prologue Oak Read and evening prayers all together. Right now, we are up to a scripture reading, a chapter of the Bible, one saint's life together, and evening prayers. And so we're getting there, but it does take time. Let me say this, Deacon. Before I had the kid, every evening I'd read the Bible till I fell asleep. It would calm me down, and it was just a great routine. And I think you store it into long-term memory when you do that.
Mm-hmm.
And then can't do that. The kid, we're singing the kid to sleep, we're playing hymns. Believe it or not, Orthodox hymns help the child go to sleep. So we're doing all this, but now I can't read anymore because everything's about what helps this kid go to sleep. And this is the horrible thing about being an apologist, and I'd appreciate everyone's prayers. Now I cannot read the Bible the moment before I go to sleep, because then apologetics brain starts taking over. Right? I can't read. I can't so you could read a saint's life maybe, but then you can't read I don't know, just a work from the Father, because then the gears start turning and you can't go to sleep. So kids really do change that, and so I feel you and I share your pain, but it's a good sort of pain.
Absolutely. Metropolitan Hilarion from your guys' tradition, Alfeyev, he has this book on St. Isaac the Syrian, who may be an interesting, spicy person to speak of when we're talking about this kind of ecumenism of the saints. And in one of the pieces of advice that St. Isaac the Syrian gives that I really like, Craig, whether you read it or not, you implemented it. He says people get caught up in how many Psalms to read when they're doing the Psalter before bed. And he would say, actually, just stand up and do as much as you can until you collapse. And he's like, if for you that's 10 chapters, then it's 10 chapters. If it's a paragraph, then that. If it's a word or a phrase, and he says, you'll get the blessing nonetheless.
Now, I think the Coptic tradition, isn't the ideal that the monk finish the Psalter in a day or something like that? What's the ideal in the Ethiopian monastic tradition?
In the Ethiopian monastic tradition, there. Look at that! I got an Ethiopian in the chat.
They love us.
In the Ethiopian monastic tradition, there are a lot of different ways you can do it. Typically, I said 10 chapters because there's something called a negus, or a king, which is what they call 10 chapters of the Psalms, and I think that's kind of enough. But yeah, there are some people who read it in a day. I met a monk before from a rural Tigray region, and he told me that on Good Friday he would read it 4 times in a row. So all 150 or 151 or whatever, like 4 times he would go through it in the same day.
Now, is it a quick rhythmic chant, sort of like the Byzantine tradition has?
Yeah, so that's the funny thing. So the guy, his native language is Tigrinya. Most of his monastic life has been in Ge'ez and Amharic. So you already have 3 different Semitic languages of Ethiopia. Ge'ez is the classical Ethiopic. It's the liturgical language, like the Old Church Slavonic and probably like the Koine Greek or the Old Greek. And so he could actually, because he's practiced in it, read the classical Ethiopic or the Ge'ez quicker than he could his native language. Because of what you're saying, like the rhythm and the chant.
Now, how much Ge'ez would a pious Ethiopian understand just from attending the services and everything?
Maybe 5 to 10%. But depends how pious, right? And depends, honestly, if we're talking about a man or a woman, because like our sisters, the Copts, and I don't know how it is in the Greek tradition, there's a lot of involvement, especially with males at a younger level, at the deacon level. And in the Coptic tradition, they have the more properly stratified hierarchy, I think, as you all do. Ours is much messier. It's all blended. And so you have many males, if they are pious, have gone through like the system at some point. And so they do actually have some training, and they would be a much higher percentage.
Now, this sounds sort of like Orthodox Jews, which is probably a negative comparison, but so forgive me. But I remember at work, I was in this repair shop owned by these Orthodox Jews, and the wife was working behind the front desk. And you know, there's all these Jewish prayer books and stuff because they've got Kabbalah and all that nonsense. And so I said, you learn all this? She says, no, that's for the men. We just look at Facebook all day. So that's like Ethiopian women are the same.
There are exceptional women. I have to say, like the monk who was the administrator of my home parish in South Central Los Angeles, he was taught by a famous nun who was obviously a woman.
But I thought South Central was a style of basketball, no blood, no foul.
it may be many things to many people, but the nun herself was a priest's kid, so who was very well trained in the poetry of the church and in the hymnography of the church. And so those exceptions are usually the daughter of a priest.
And I think it also comes, at least in the old country, how people are directly or indirectly involved with worship, because I've heard that a lot of the women and children are outside because you can't get kids to stand during this thing for hours, so the mothers are with them. And these are historical, very old medieval churches, so the men are inside because there's limited space. So that also creates a difference in interaction. But maybe these days they actually have loudspeakers outside, because I know that's what they do in Europe now. But of course, in ye old days, there were no loudspeakers. So now, Evangelos, you know all sorts of languages. You going to learn Ge'ez for us?
Well, I think maybe down the line, we'll see. I have some other languages I'd like to work on before.
What are the languages you're working on?
Well, I'm not working on anything currently, but I'd like to learn a little bit of Slavonic. Just in terms of the history of the church, I find it's an important language, and in terms
you got
of
most of the letters down already.
Sorry?
You got most of the letters down already.
Yeah, there's that. Although my pronunciation is not too great, there's some very difficult sounds. So we'll see.
It's I mean, that we really need someone who's going to do a lot of serious manuscript work from a Orthodox tradition in Ethiopia, just for the amount of manuscripts and stuff we still really don't fully know. Because even in Slavonic, we're getting like really important stuff, like from St. Methodius of Olympus, that is not out yet, and yet it's in Slavonic. It's not even like that's within the European periphery, let alone the periphery beyond that. We talk about Armenian, Ethiopian, and other things like that. So I just find that very interesting. So before we really get started in the nitty-gritty of the Ethiopian saints, Evangelos, the real inspiration for this collaboration is your excellent book. Everyone loves it. I think Deacon Henok was saying that. Did he say you were crying tears of joy reading the book? If I remember right,
especially the Martyrs of Nadran.
Yeah.
it's hard not to. And it's funny, I had a random friend I hadn't talked to in like half a year call me last night, and he hadn't read the book, but he just started talking about the martyrs of Najran. So I feel like something's in the air where their story is being told more and more.
And so, yeah, this brings to the forefront these very important saints in our respective churches. And so my question first for you, Evangelos, because you're really the one who got the ball rolling with this, is your book talks about this, the sources you used, and it appears because of your language background, you've depended upon Latin and Greek. So how about you give us a little bit of a window of the appreciation of the Ethiopian saints in the West and Mediterranean world?
Yeah, so I became interested particularly in the subject when I was posting some excerpts of saints' lives on my church's website a couple years ago. And we have like a sort of calendar that I manage where every Sunday I'll just post the service for the saint. And that particular Sunday happened to be the commemoration of St Aretheus and the martyrs of Najran. And I read the story and I was just blown away with the martyrdom and the story of the faith of these people. And I started looking into it a bit more, and I realized there was just so much more information on that historical period. And then that got me interested in the kingdom of Aksum and the political landscape of the period. And then for Scriptorium, we're always looking to publish things that haven't been done before. So I started looking into what texts would be available to publish in English that hadn't been translated. And that's how basically I got the idea for the compilation. So the texts that are part of the book, the first one is, the first two texts, they're in Greek, and they're about the life of Saint Moses, the Ethiopian. So technically he wasn't from the kingdom of Aksum, he was from Egypt, but I thought it would be interesting to include, firstly because he's the most well-known figure when we think of Ethiopian saints in the West, and also because he's a very important ascetic father, and he's up there, with St Anthony and St Macarius. So I think it provided a good lens into understanding the type of spirituality and monasticism that was current in Egypt in those centuries. And then the second text is an excerpt from the church history of Rufinus, who was the Latin priest and translator. And he recounts a story that he learned firsthand from a priest in Tyre in Lebanon, about how the first missionaries arrived in Ethiopia, which he calls India, but that's a whole other question about.
And just so the audience is aware, Rufinus is writing this essentially within the lifetime of people that were still alive when this was occurring. This isn't like something centuries removed. It's quite contemporary.
No, he says what I'm relating, I did not hear from common rumor, but from the mouth itself of the person who was there and witnessed all these things. And the first bishop, Frumentius of Ethiopia, was ordained by St Athanasius, actually. So there's a very early apostolic presence there. So that's a Latin source. So the two first were Greek, this was Latin, and then we did some translations of native Ethiopian texts, but since I don't speak the original, we relied on an edition that was basically an early 20th century published edition with a facing literal Latin translation. So we worked off of that, and then I consulted some people I knew through the web when I had some difficulty, just to like double check that we're on the right track. And then so the bulk of the book is the martyrdom of the Arethas and the Christians of Najran, which is also pretty contemporary to the martyrdom itself. So really all the sources are very historically accurate.
Now, let me ask two questions. One will be for you and the other for Deacon Henok. So for you, what was the appeal of Ethiopia's saints during the Middle Ages, even when there was no communion between Ethiopia and the Eastern Orthodox or the Roman Catholics? Because they kept relating and repeating these saints' lives. So there was an obvious appeal of these saints. So what was that? What's your insight after translating this book?
As far as I can tell, because shortly after this period, there were the Islamic invasions that really cut off the Horn of Africa from communication with the Mediterranean world. There doesn't seem to have been a great deal of awareness or I wouldn't say interest, but just it wasn't in the radar of the people at the time. The one exception would be the martyrs of Nadran, which was a very famous story, which was then incorporated in the various synaxarion collections in the 10th and 11th centuries. And in one of those, the Minologion of Basil II, which is 10th century or early 11th century, it refers to King Kaleb as the most Christian king. So there was a recognition that there was these holy people that were commemorated on the calendar. And then in terms of other references, I couldn't find many, but there was this one interesting one that I wanted to share with you guys. This is from Patriarch Germanos II of Constantinople in 1232. So this is in the period after the schism with the West, when they were in dialogue to perhaps reunite the two churches. He sent this letter to the cardinals of Rome, and he was an anti-unionist patriarch, but he was still trying to attempt this reconciliation, if we could say. And there was this interesting passage that caught my eye. So he says, I write these things to your holiness only for recollection, for I know that you are filled with all wisdom and knowledge. This alone will I add, and I will end my peace, that there are many and great nations of like mind and in fellowship with us Greeks in all things. First, in the first part of the east dwell the Ethiopians, then all the Syrians, to the north the most manly Iberians, the Georgians, the Lazi, the Alans, the Goths, the Khazars, the innumerable Russian peoples, and the conquering kingdom of the Bulgarians. All of these hold to our church as a mother, remaining unshaken in the ancient orthodoxy. Which
That's awesome.
I found this interesting because, well, it's unclear which Ethiopians he's talking about. He could be referring just generally to maybe the Christians in India, but still, I found it was interesting that he would mention all these peoples in this letter to the West, and that he seems to show an awareness, first of all, of their existence, and that there is this shared Eastern identity or Eastern
and certainly this
spirituality.
would draw interest in the lives of shared saints from Ethiopia.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't want to get ahead of ourselves, but we will discuss some surprising Constantinopolitan saints that are still to this day in the Ethiopian synaxarion. And I'm personally suspicious that due to the Ethiopian mission in Jerusalem, that there were periods of reconciliation between the communions, and this may explain why there's shared saints and perhaps the statement you just read. But I don't want to unpack that too much at the moment, and I want to ask my other question to Deacon Henok, which is, and it's an obvious answer, but we'd appreciate you kind of unpacking for us, are pre-schism saints between our communion all Amharic or not? And how do Ethiopians feel about their ethnic diversity of their saints?
So, pre-schism saints, it would be very weird to call them Amharic. The history of the language is very contested. It's a huge political issue. The Amharic tribe, of which I'm a member, were the dominant tribe of Ethiopia, and the main force, not the exclusive force, but the main force of the ruling class for over 700 years, from the 1200s till 1974, when communism struck. and they haven't been fully in power since over the past 50 years.
Quick
But because of
interruption. Are you guys going to make a comeback?
I hope so.
Okay.
One can
All
hope.
right. So there's hope. All right.
If so, we'll get another great Orthodox Christian king.
We hope so. Okay, continue.
Which, by the way, some people think it's like a historical impossibility. My parents are like that. My dad thinks it's impossible and he doesn't want it back. My mom thinks it's impossible and she would love it back. And there are other people who, especially young people, who they were very nostalgic about this time that they never knew, and but for them it's all a dream. And I think were it to happen,
it's the golden age. It's the golden age. Yeah.
Exactly. And before the 1200s, it becomes very hotly contested. From the 1200s onwards, Amharic speaking is very prominent, and we have Amharic literature. There are some people who trace some very minuscule evidence to the 800s, and even I think once I've seen the 400s, but the 400s is very scanty. And so in all of the time period we're talking about in the early church, really the language at hand is Ge'ez, which is classical Ethiopic. And so that's the safest thing you can say. And even then we could say it's the language of the church and the empire. We're sure there were other languages around that were simply spoken and not written down. And so it's possible. I mean, just like when you think of, people don't discuss this often, but the North African fathers, right? If you're in Egypt, Athanasius was mentioned earlier. All his writings we get are in Greek, but very possible that in his home he was speaking Coptic. And later, after division, the church there decided to kind of start using Coptic more, even though Greek was the basis everywhere. And in the western part of North Africa, probably some Berber languages were spoken in the house of people like Augustine and Tertullian, but their written literary professional language was Latin, because Carthage and all that was included in the Roman Empire. And so that type of thing could have been going on, and Ge'ez served as that main official language or lingua franca during that early time. But by the way, on the coins at the time, on the Aksumite coins of this period, you see both Greek right? and Ge'ez. In fact, there are monuments at our old port site at Adulis from even when Ethiopia was pagan, and you see sacrifices to Ares in Semitic named Mahrem, written in Greek. On certain monuments, so they were bilingual even at that time as well. And of course, that's probably because the Red Sea or the Eritrean Sea, was known in Greek. Eritrean just means red in Greek. That sea, probably the lingua franca there was Greek, and they were a merchant people as well. As to the latter part of your question, ethnic diversity has been used for political reasons by the successive regimes since communism. There have been 3 different regimes rooted in either class communism or race communism. And so that's ruined some of the issues of ethnic diversity. But there's a lot of ethnic diversity in Ethiopia. There are at least 5 to 6 main tribes, and the government would have you believe there's 87. I think it's exaggerated, but there are 80 plus languages. I don't think each language deserves a country or deserves to be called a separate tribe. Some of this stuff is like dialect.
Oh, so this is like the Ethiopian version of Russian Ukraine. Russian, Ukrainian's not a real language. They're not a real ethnic group. And depending where in Ukraine, I hear them repeat the same thing. And I don't know about Ethiopian sense of humor, but Slavs have a very cold, dry sense of humor. And so they could be saying something ridiculous, but they'll give it with such a plain, matter-of-fact delivery. It's hard not to take it at face value. So even I'm not fully sure exactly what's going on. When I speak to people with families that were from Ukraine, but in the Austria-Hungarian days and stuff like that, it's a different language. And I kind of trust them most because they're not involved in these 21st century disputes. But that being said, it's what really jumped out at me reading the synaxarion and also the book Ethiopian Saints by Evangelos is Ethiopia has, they use maybe the term somewhat improperly, but colloquially, a very Catholic view of themselves and their saints. The saints are from everywhere. There's, of course, a large emphasis on their own national saints, like any synaxarion of any orthodoxy, but also a particularly large emphasis on Coptic saints, because it appears there's a great deal of dependence upon Alexandria, which would have been the Coptic Orthodox. And so I think that's quite palpable as well. Now, before we continue, I just want to give the audience an opportunity to pretty much see a few things here. For one, the mission in Cambodia. If shows like this bless you and really help you draw closer to God and learn a lot about the faith, please support the evangelization of the Cambodian people to Christianity at orthodoxchristiantheology.com/donate. Links are below. For just $10, you could be responsible for translating a Life of the Saint that's never been translated before into the Khmer language. A lot of donors have really been supporting this enthusiastically, and it's very much appreciated. We will continue until we have a whole year of the saints done, and then we'll work on a longer catechism of St. Philaret and make a permanently bound version of the Lives of Saints. So please support this and other works and to support the churches there in Cambodia at orthodoxchristiantheology.com/donate. Links to the Patreon to be a monthly donor, to PayPal and Venmo are below. Also, if you want to learn more about this topic, about the lives of the saints, please see the Saints of Ethiopia by Scriptorium Press. Link is below to their Amazon link, and it's literally borderline given away for free if you look at the printing fees of these books. So, Evangelos, how do you make money selling this book? It's actually very inexpensive.
Well, it's meant to edify people, so I feel bad, gouging an arm and a leg for it. But maybe when we scale it up, it'll be a bit more profitable in the long term.
So he wants to become the Walmart of Saints' lives. He makes almost no money, but selling millions of these, hopefully, and that will make it a full-time job. As for me, I lose money doing this. It's just a matter of, again, helping raise money for the Cambodian church. And Deacon Henok, you have a YouTube channel. Tell us what you're up to and where people could find you out.
Yes, I don't want to confuse people. The YouTube is pretty easy to find. If you just type H.E. Nagash in there, it should come up. The show is called The Philosophy of Art and Science. I've been trying to shift more from video to the written word to try to be more like Evangelos, actually. I'm just a lot slower. And so you can find my shorter form than a book writings at oxum.substack.com. And I'm also on Gumroad, oxum.gumroad.com. My Gumroad I want to turn into its own legit press the way Evangelos has Scriptorium, and I want to start like publishing. I already have 3 things I'm working on, and that's my issue. I need to learn how to focus, finish one, and move on to the next. But the Gumroad, oxum.gumroad, is for the purposes of getting books out there, and then oxum.substack it's a newsletter publication, or you can consider an online magazine where I do book reviews and things of the sort. But I also share the videos from YouTube there as like a cross posting.
Please send me those links and we will share them, and support Deacon Henok in that work as well. And I think there'll be future work. He doesn't know it yet. And it's going to be Orthodox faith in child rearing. That's what we were talking about before. That's one of the things I'm hoping to branch out into, get into discussing how we do Christian education at home. As for being Father of the Year, that's not me, so I won't be teaching that. But maybe that'll be Deacon Henok. I'm sure he's working on being Father of the Year. We're going to have to get Evangelos hitched so he could start getting rolling on that as well. Let's become a monk. They never talk about that, but considering that. We'll see what Evangelos does with his life. Anyway, so we will keep going. And I want to talk about St. Jared. For me, I thought that was the most interesting saint life in the book, because the whole liturgical element was something that I found very interesting. So let me ask a really basic question. Are St. Jared's melodies still used in the Ethiopian church?
Absolutely. He's kind of this mythical, legendary figure. And so like with David and like with Paul later, I would say there's the saint himself, and then there's the Jaredian school, right? And so he laid down what is considered the 3 fundamental melodies of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, which are called Ge'ez, like the language, but it also means first, and it also means free. In this context, it means first. Izil and ararai. I'm not a great melodist, and so I can't sing for you. I'd have to introduce you to others who could give
why
you
don't you
better
try serenade
examples.
Go.
But
Is there a Paschal hymn that you're singing right now?
Yes.
Yeah. What's that sound like? Just him. You can hum it if you want.
So okay, this is really bad, and other people will improve it. But it's the same one that you guys have. We just add a line. Okay. So Christos tansa mutane mota wa kedo la mota la illa wusta maqaber wa haba hiwat zala alam rafta. Christ is risen from the dead, trampling down death by death, and upon those in the tombs bestowing life and eternal rest. So the "and eternal rest" is a line that we add that you don't have. I often say when we translate from the Greek, we usually add our own spices. And that's said in the middle of the liturgy chanted. And then there's the call and response that you have the Christos anesti, alitos anesti, the Christ is risen, truly is risen. We have an expanded form that is Christos tansa'a mutan, babi hail wasiltan, asaro la seitan, aga azola addam, salam, imyazesa, kona, Fisaha wa salam, and then we ululate. Christ is risen from the dead with great power and authority. He, having incarcerated Satan, he freed Adam. From now on, let there be peace. Yes, let there be, or hereafter, joy and peace.
I think that's wonderful because it's really owning it, but actually within a authentic ethos, expanding upon it, which is a lot of the sacred tradition, all the Orthodox churches. My personal favorite, though, is the Georgian hymn. Christ is risen from the dead, trampling down death by death, and upon those in the tombs, bestowing life. Now people can make a YouTube short of that and make fun of my singing, but I think that's the coolest out of all of them. Evangelos, what's your vote?
Well, I'm biased. I like the Byzantine Greek tradition. I always found the Russian one sounded a bit too fast, but I've learned to like appreciate all of them. Yeah.
There we go. We appreciate all the tradition. Nice to see Eastern Orthodox, Oriental Orthodox getting along. I'm all new to this. The difference seems to be a lot smaller than some people seem to claim, and maybe we could return to that during question and answer. That's an interesting thing. But we definitely share these saints, so we're talking about this and St. Jared. So maybe
if I may, Craig, on that small point, you titled this the Pre-Schism Saints of Ethiopia, but both St. Aretheus and St. Jared are post-schism.
Well, not exactly, actually, right? Because they're early 6th century, and the schism really wasn't fully consummated until a parallel hierarchy was made in Egypt and Syria, and that really waited until after the death of St. Justinian. So it depends how we define schism in that sense, and we could debate that in a fun way. I'd like to take a broader, more welcoming view of the Ethiopian church in that case. But yes, it's a lot. Traditionally speaking, I'm guessing in the Oriental Orthodox tradition, the schism seen at Chalcedon, and my historical view is this actually took some time after Chalcedon, more than a century to really consummate. But worth bringing up, and thank you, Deacon Henok. Now, let me ask this about St. Jared before I forget, because I got a bad short-term memory. Now, how is Ethiopian singing different than Coptic singing? And was this something that preceded St. Jared, or was he the real cause of it?
Yeah, I gotta be careful. I don't mean this to be offensive, and this is actually in the book itself, which cracked me up. But in the book, there's
I added that on purpose actually because it was a long life, and then so I was sort of abbreviating parts, and I'm like, I think this should stay in. So I appreciated it.
It mentions that it's not like the murmuring of the Egyptians, and there is a funny part of that.
Your music's good. is what you're trying to say.
It is, and
Unlike the other news.
I appreciate the Copts too, but to speak about it in like a mature way, it's both comedic and tragic, right?
Hmm.
The comedy element is this it's not like the murmuring, right? And I had some Coptic friends laugh at that too in reading that review, and they kind of agree. But the reason behind that is because like another name for the Coptic Church is the Church of the Martyrs. You know, they've pretty much like almost never run themselves. They're always being conquered by different people, and they've been under the specter of Islam, different groups, like now local Muslims, but for a long time, different Turkic groups were running them ever since like the Mongols or the Huns or the Mamluks or whoever was coming down, right? And so they were and have been in that kind of primitive early church, persecuted church state, like the pre-Constantine church, throughout their entire existence. And that makes for a very different church. And so they have a more muted rite, R-I-T-E, because they haven't been given the kind of freedom to elaborate. They've always been in the persecuted state. What's interesting about the Byzantine tradition, I know from one of my mentors, the great Father Mark Boulos, who's from your tradition, but whose father is a Copt and his mother is a Palestinian from the Greek Rite. He serves in the Twin Cities in Minneapolis and St. Paul, and has for many years. He told me he was a student of John Meyendorff at St. Vladimir's.
Yeah.
And he told me there are two main rites in the Byzantine tradition. There's the original Palestinian rite, which is just like the recitation of the Psalms, right? And I've heard Father Maximos Constans say this as well. And then the other rite is this more elaborate, the proper Byzantine tradition, which almost draws on like the theater tradition that was pagan and was there before, and then baptizes it into the Christian rite. And those two were fused together. And in Ethiopia, similar things I could say happened. We maintained our sovereignty throughout. We were never conquered. And so because of that, even after Constantinople fell in the 1400s, we had another 500 years to elaborate this tradition. And that's why I say the school of Jared, because Jared is from the 6th century, right? And so he established the base melodies. Before him, it says that the church was Wurdenibab, which is like, this is what it sounds like. This is Wurdenibab. It's called the descending voice. And everything was read in this way. People learn how to read and write in this melody, and we use it when we read the readings because it's considered to be a more solemn voice during Good Passion Week, during Holy Week. And it says before Jared, that's how the whole liturgy was read. And it could still be done that way now, but people don't do that. They sing these elaborate melodies that began in the 6th century, but then were elaborated upon for 1400 years after that.
So it's a whole
in a
school
sovereign
of music.
state. Absolutely.
It's
And there are rival schools within Ethiopia, within different regions, some which are recognized as universal houses of certification for that school, and others who are still competing to this day. And so there's a lot of lack of standardization even within Ethiopia.
It's what I find, honestly, I don't know, not the right word, but like fantastic, is the ossification of the Ethiopian tradition, that you have all these ways of singing and doing things that are going back preceding the 6th century. And so this is something that is very common among a lot of the Orthodox traditions, besides maybe the Russians, because they've totally revamped all their music in the 18th century. And but it's just something that shows you preserve the original way of doing it, and then you continue with improving upon it and doing it in different ways. I don't know, something I've always appreciated about Eastern Orthodoxy as a whole, because I'm a convert. Both of you were born into this faith and then owned it for yourselves, of course, as adults. So I see this almost like more as an outsider, seeing how the Orthodox traditions preserve their liturgical diversity. Now, let me ask you about this, because this I find very peculiar, specific to the Ethiopian way of doing things, is the use of instrumentation. I think drums. Could you explain to me the use of instrumentation in Ethiopian Orthodoxy, and does this come from St. Jared?
Yes, so it is attributed to him. The exact verifiable history is mucky, and there's a lot of scholarship being done on it. frankly, there are a lot of Ethiopians, but also Europeans working on it in Hamburg, Germany, at Hamburg University. There's a huge library, and they're working on trying to exactly find the dates. What's positive is that the more they try to make it seem like more modern, the more they keep finding older manuscripts, and that always makes me pleased. The thing that probably frustrates some people the most when they try to make it too modern is like our Garima Gospels, which are from between the 4th and 6th centuries. And they're these illuminated gospel manuscripts. But as for the singing tradition...
Let me just make fun of the Germans for 1 second. Germany is the most overrated country, and Germans have the most overrated culture. And I'm going to tell you guys why. Because one, all of their academic theories all end up being disproven ultimately, even in physics, right? You know, and especially in the patristic and scriptural studies, all end up being disproven. They're terrible at winning world wars. I mean, come on, they keep losing world wars. Their cars are awful. They're great to work on because you make a lot of money. All the parts are very expensive, and they're very labor-intensive fix, and they break all the time, and yet people love them anyway. So as an auto mechanic, it's great to work on German cars. And so Germany, most overrated country ever. And so that aside, please continue, Deacon. You know,
That's hilarious. I thought at least... Oh, go ahead, Evangelos.
No, I just said we look forward to your hate mail.
I was going to say I look forward to his car reviews, but should add that. But I thought they had at least to the cars.
Oh, no, their cars are terrible. No, everyone wants them. Deacon, you're in California. Do you ever visit Ethiopia at all? Were you brought there as a kid or anything like that?
Yeah, so I was born and raised in Los Angeles, but I find myself in Cascadia now, actually, Seattle proper, in the Pacific Northwest. I used to go as a child every year for a long time, especially while my grandparents were alive. My mom made it her mission to visit her mother every single year. She was sick, and so she was a school teacher like I am. That's my day job, and so she would visit every year. My dad, not as often, but he would go. Since 2011, I haven't gone, so now it's been 14 years.
Oh, it's gonna be
but
different.
Also, in that time, I picked up Guz, which I did not know back then, and my Amharic has improved a lot. So it's almost like I created that space in diaspora. But going back to
here's why. Because when you're in Ethiopia, I'm sure in the capital city, you see all sorts of Mercedes, right?
Yep.
Yeah, right. See, like Americans, and I don't know about Canadians as much, but like they don't understand. Like you'll see more Lamborghinis, Ferraris, Mercedes, Maybachs. You'll see that in the third world country capital cities. Way more. Like I almost never see it on an American street. You have to be like,
well, in
Wall
LA,
Street
I will say in LA you will see it, especially in Beverly Hills,
because you've got Asians and Ethiopians and all these well-to-do foreigners there, and they love showing off their money, and plus the celebrities.
Yes, there's definitely that.
It's in. I go to Phnom Penh once a year, so I go to Cambodia once a year, and yeah, you see all these fancy cars, and that's why with the German cars, everyone thinks they're great, and when they get the money, they want the German cars. But here's the secret: they're made like junk. So that being said, it's anyway. We're here to talk about Ethiopian saints.
Yeah, to get back to the Ethiopians, by the way, trust the Japanese cars. I don't know how you feel about that.
And the Asians, yeah, Cambodia, same thing. The reliable cars are Toyotas.
Yep, almost all Ethiopians have had a Camry or Corolla in their life.
There you go.
But the instruments,
Toyota Helix too. If you're in the countryside, maybe a Toyota Helix.
Yeah, a lot of people misinterpret the drum online. You see actually certain hateful ortho bros and rad trad Catholics who get confused by the drum because they think that we're using it during the Eucharistic liturgy. And that's the big confusion that happens. Okay. Our Eucharistic liturgy is like all the Orthodox traditions, a cappella. And the one exception to that is that there's a bell, and the bell is rung at certain particular moments, like this Christ is risen troparion or hymn that we were just talking about. And like the Lord have mercies right before receiving communion and at the beginning. So the bell kind of marks certain occasions, but it's not really a musical instrument. It's very brief. The Eucharistic liturgy or the divine liturgy is a cappella. Because we've had all this time to elaborate, what Jared does, I mean, these aren't the best translations, but if you use like Vespers and Matins as like stand-ins, what he does is it's way beyond that. 3 to 4 times a month, there are Jaredian services from the night before around 8 p.m. until 5 a.m. And so I don't know if you call that Vespers or Matins, but whatever that is, it's before the Divine Liturgy.
All night vigil, yeah.
Mm-hmm, it's a night vigil, and it's done 3 to 4 times a month. If you're in the city of Gondar, which I always say for the Lord of the Rings fans, that I'm sure that the African J.R.R. Tolkien drew upon this great African city, Gondar, which preserved and elaborated upon a lot of Jared's tradition, especially from the 1600s onwards. If you're in the city of Gondar even today and many moons ago, because the lives of the saints are celebrated and commemorated every day, you can do a vigil like this every single day if you want to. Every single day, 8 p.m. to 5 a.m. in the city of Gondar, you can find these pre-Eucharistic liturgies or vigils or vespers or whatever you want to call them. And so it's within that tradition that the kabaro, or the Afro-Asiatic kettle drum, is hit, and the prayer staff or the walking stick is held. And then we also have the sanasal, which is the sistrum or the sistra, which you see also, Evangelos would appreciate, in the artwork from the island of Crete during the Minoan civilization. You see them using the same sistra. Right.
Yeah,
you see it also in the ancient Egyptian pharaonic religion as well. And so those are very ancient instruments. But the sistra, the kettle drum, which is a hand drum, and the walking stick or the prayer staff, like those 3 instruments are used throughout the year, except during Lent or the Great Fast, we take 2 months where we don't use the sistra and we don't use the drum at all.
Now we're going to change gears. I want to talk about the origins of at least the Ethiopian Orthodox Church properly, and this gets into St Frumentius. He's considered Ethiopia's first bishop, but Christianity obviously existed in Ethiopia before then. So this is open to either of you. Was it a bishopless church, or was it just erratic who was bishop? Because, obviously St. Matthew was a bishop. So how did it work before St. Frumentius?
I could go first, and then Deacon could flesh it out.
There you go, Evangelos.
So there is an early reference, of course, in the book of Acts to the Ethiopian eunuch who's baptized. And then there is some debate about whether he was from Aksum proper or he was more from the region of Nubia. But it is a recurrent theme in scholarship, that people have noticed some Judaic influences in the Ethiopian church. So that either speaks to perhaps a substratum that was there beforehand, and then when the apostles preached, people converted from that, and then they kept some of these practices. In terms of the earliest bishop, I think Frumentius would be the first bishop, because in Rufinus's account, he says that at the time the only Christians in the country were merchants from the Roman Empire who would come down the Red Sea, and it was actually Frumentius who encouraged them to build permanent places of worship and churches, and as Rufinus says, for the seed of the Christians to rise up in that place. And then afterwards, there doesn't seem to have been a continuous succession, or if there was, it's not recorded, because there's different missions that are attested fragmentarily in later sources. In the, for example, in the early 5th century, there's this Bishop Moses of Adulis who is referred to, and we don't know anything more about him. He's just referred to by Palladius, a writer of that period. And then there were some other missions that went to that targeted Yemen, but those were sent and financed by the Arian emperor. And then really it's really in the I would say late 5th century and early 6th century that there's a much more developed hierarchy that comes into place that we can trace.
Deacon Henok, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think even from Frumentius all the way, let me just go back and say to his point, I think it's very clearly Nubia in many places in the New Testament and Old Testament / Meroe. And I think there was a strong Christian community there till about the 4th century AD. and we pretty much appropriated their name and have been Ethiopia since. And so it's just like what he said. Sometimes Ethiopia is even Indian. He could talk about the etymology. It means like burnt face or basically darker skinned person. And so it's like the swarthy swaths across Africa and Asia who were darker than the Greek writers, you know, who already had a nice tan, right? Like that's who it's referring to. In the case of scripture, I do think it's more Nubia/Meroe or modern day Sudan. But those are obviously like very close to us genetically and culturally. We're their neighbors. And I think there were these kind of merchants, the way that he was saying, and Frumentius does establish it. It's important to note Frumentius himself. Today, people in America would kind of mislabel them Arabs. You hear people like Nassim Taleb and everyone pushing for this Eastern Mediterranean identity. And that's what they are. They'd be Levantine. Like Frumentius would have been from the Levant, but his, you know, educational literary language would have been Greek. And so you see a lot of Greek loanwords, especially during Passion Week, used in the Ethiopian church, and especially even more in the Coptic church, like Pantokrator and Agios, and many more. Even we have a famous line where we quote the thief on the cross on the right of the Lord, and we say in Greek on Good Friday, "Remember us, Lord, in your kingdom," in like a very bastardized Greek, like still to this day. And only on that day, but
probably still better than how we speak Greek in America.
yeah. At least we're closer to the location. And the Kyrie eleison is obviously universal, even in the Latin Church. But I would say the period from Frumentius's time in the 4th century, and by the way, he revitalized our alphabet. It used to have no vowels, and he's attributed to creating vowels for our system of alphabet, which added 7 columns where it used to have only 1. And it turned it from like 30 something letters to 200 plus letters. But from his time period to, I'd say, the 1200s, the history of the succession is very hazy. And some of my scholarly friends even believe this theory that it may have been abbots kind of acting as bishops for the most part, functionally, with the kind of very loose supervision of the Copts, or maybe not. And sometimes in some periods in like the 1100s or 1200s, before it's solidified, you hear that there are random Armenian and Syrian bishops in Aksum, and you're like, what are they doing over there? Are they just visiting, or are they running the place? The firm, like really strong historical record is during the Amhara kingdom from 1270 to the present day, where the Copts made a deal with Saint Taklahaimanot, and that's why Saint Taklahaimanot is very revered in the Coptic tradition. And they recognized the new government that took place in Ethiopia in 1270, which called itself a restoration government from another dynasty that had ruled for a couple hundred years. And from 1270 to the 1970s and to the present, that record is very written, and it's very clearly Coptic metropolitans being sent from Alexandria. But the period from the 300s until the 1200s is, I would say, very hazy.
Yeah, my guess would have been similar to the Russian church, early Russian church. It would have been a motley crew and a mixture of people throughout the world, as you're referring to, and people that are already there. I think the abbot has largely replaced the early church office of the core bishop or the country bishop. And so sometimes core bishops wouldn't even really be called bishop because they're really closer to an abbot. They could consecrate orders that aren't actually the holy orders, like, you know, readers and exorcists and things like that, but otherwise not do the function of bishops. And sometimes they're called bishop, which creates confusion. Like, what exactly is this bishop? I would also imagine that a lot of the merchant community would have had bishops just passing through, or they were just passing through. So that would require less of a permanent episcopal presence. In
Quickly
Ethiopia.
on this point, Taklahaimanot, who's one of the saints I mentioned, like Alexandria is known as the See of Mark, right? And through Mark the evangelist, you have a Petrine and a Pauline legacy, because he's originally a disciple of St. Peter, but ultimately a disciple of St. Paul, just like Luke was. In Ethiopia, it's called the See of Taklahaimanot. And to this day, they say that, or the throne, or the See of Taklahaimanot. And Taklahaimanot was the abbot. He was the abbot of the Debre Libanos, or the Mount Lebanon monastery, which is in very close proximity to the capital city, and the title is called Chage or Hasege originally, which means he who is in proximity to the emperor. So it's like the chief abbot of the chief monastery, which is in close proximity to the emperor, and it's called the See of Taklahaimanot to this day, and that title's been subsumed in our title of patriarch since we achieved autocephaly in the mid 20th century. But prior to that, even when we were under the See of Mark, we would call ourselves the See of Taklahaimanot, which is really weird, naming yourself after like an abbot. To your point of the core bishop.
There's
now,
if I could just add something in my reading of the history, at least, there seems to be a very important emphasis placed in the monastic tradition as a continuator and guardian of the identity of the nation and of the church traditions, which reminds me personally a lot of what happened during the Turkish period in Greece, where it was really these like monastic centers, like on the Holy Mountain, Mount Athos, and other places that not only preserved the ancient tradition, but also later served as springboards for Greek nationalism and the revitalization of the country in the 19th century.
Now, Deacon Henok, how did Frumentius, get received? Because he tutored the royalty of Ethiopia and he's made a bishop. So how exactly did that help him be successful?
Yeah, so I should say his initial visit there as a boy was very brutal. It was a crash landing. People should know this, especially as they study scripture. There's a reason that the Israelites were afraid of water. You see many times in the Psalm that God brought us through water and fire. It's because water is scary. Water has sea monsters, as Jonathan Pageau reminds us very often. But also, it's a dangerous trip. There's always a risk. So he crash landed on the shore of the Red Sea at one of our ports in the Horn of Africa. And when he was there, the various people who were there were kind of like barbarians. It wasn't the Aksumites proper. And so these were not the Christians that first greeted him. They were kind of nomadic marauders. And for whatever
like slave
reason,
traders.
They could have been, yeah, they could have been, especially during that time. They basically massacred all the adults and spared the two boys, and Frumentius, I think, and his brother. And then they sold them into slavery to the royal proper Aksumite kingdom. And there he grew up as a pedagogue, or the teacher of the princes. And it was through that King Gizana, once he became the king, made Aksum officially a Christian country, where we always debate with the Armenians. I believe our written record is stronger, but whichever one you take, the oral or the written, it's either Armenia or Ethiopia is the first kingdom, and they're within about 20 years of each other in the 300s.
We're going with Ethiopia.
and so it becomes a Christian kingdom because of the strong faith of the child Frumentius, who then later grows up and then becomes a bishop after asking Athanasius the Great for a bishopry for Aksum. And when he comes back, he's received very well. He's called Abba Salamma. There's a theological college today in Ethiopia named after him. So his episcopal name is Abba Salamma. And to this day, we remember him very fondly. And he seems to have learned the culture very well and adapted and made a lot of great translations from Greek into Ge'ez for the people. Like I said, he modified our alphabet, whereas it seems like a lot of our Coptic overseers, frankly, mismanaged us. And there were a lot of scandals throughout the ages when they were there.
Yeah, a Coptic captivity, perhaps. But that being said, St Frumentius is almost like a St. Patrick figure on opposite ends of the world. It's very similar stories and very interesting. We have greetings from Corinth, and Christ is risen, Konstantinos, Christos Anesti. And let me ask this question, and I want to ask you, Deacon Henok, because I want to get your react to this. Why is Saint Moses the most popular Ethiopian saint in the West? And who is the most popular Ethiopian saint in Ethiopia?
Yeah, so this goes back to the question. Again, it's very funny. We don't really have Saint Moses in our tradition.
Really?
The Egyptians do. And because we're in the same communion, he's within our communion. But in our text, I've never come across like an original Ge'ez text of Saint Moses. And in English, he's alternatively called Saint Moses the Ethiopian, Saint Moses the Black, and Saint Moses the Strong. And I've been to a great monastery of his in Barstow, more specifically Newberry Springs, California, which is the halfway marker between Los Angeles and Las Vegas. And it's dedicated to them. And I've read the life of this saint before, and it was great to read Evangelos' translation as well. But this saint, I think, is so powerful because he's so gangster. There's this guy on TikTok who made like these gangster edits, and a lot of people do it because he was a real thug. If you've ever seen Aladdin and the 40 Thieves, it reminds me a lot of that story. He was like a real bad guy, a real bad man. Hardcore. And so his conversion was very much like Paul. I think it's the reason we like Paul so much. It's when you were such like a horrible person, and then you had a hard transition to using your zeal for the Lord. I have this thing, the Psalm verse, zeal for your house consumes me or devours me. And the Lord quotes it when he's throwing over the tables of the money changers. I think that like my favorite person is a zealous person. The people I have a pet peeve for are the lazy Orthodox, and there are some, because a zealous person, even if they're going the wrong way, you can redirect them to the right way. My football coach in high school used to say this all the time. He'd say there's no such thing as a hard mistake. If you go out there and hit somebody, you're doing your job. And so I think there's a way to redirect a zeal.
It reminds me of St. Joseph the Hesychast, that before he became a monastic, Elder from blessed memory makes mention that he was a merchant in the city, and he would fight with, I guess they were like Russian immigrants, which were the day laborers of Greece in those days. He'd fight with the Russians because I guess they'd try to rob him. And so all that strength and, quite frankly, aggression and energy was channeled into his asceticism. So, right, like you're working with that in order to direct that in a holy way.
Absolutely. And the second part of your question, the actual most famous saints in Ethiopia, it's obviously Saint Taklahaimanot, who I mentioned earlier, but a great mirror for Saint Moses the Black or the Ethiopian, I always would say, is Saint Gabra Manfas Kudus. And Saint Gabra Manfas Kudus, according to Ethiopian texts, is an Egyptian, but then the Egyptians don't have any text about him, as far as I know. And so that's a great mirror where they have someone they call an Ethiopian we don't have text about, and we have someone we call an Egyptian we don't have text about. He's the saint that grows his hair out all over his body, so he walks around naked because his beard and hair covers his whole body. And he's so in tune with nature and the creation that when a bird is thirsty, he lets the bird drink out of his eye. And so Saint Gabra Manfas Kudus is a big saint. Another big one is Abuna Aragawi. We use this word Abuna; it means our father. We use it of Taklahaimanot. We also use it of Abuna Aragawi. Abuna Aragawi is one of the 9 saints. I've gotten funny questions from people because sometimes they're called Syrian and sometimes they're called Roman, right? They're not Roman like from Rome. They're Roman as in they lived in this Eastern Mediterranean, in the Levantine part of the eastern part of the Roman Empire. I talked about this with our mutual friend, Sub-Deacon Daniel Kakish. Nobody knows 100% for sure, but they were either from the Levant proper or from Mesopotamia. If they were from Mesopotamia, they probably spoke Syriac. If they were from the Levant, it would have been Greek. In either way, they were likely some of, I would say on our side, the victims of the Miaphysite controversy in that area. And so they fled the Greco-Syrian Near East and entered into Ethiopia. From there, they established monasteries and helped spread the faith around the time of St. Jared. And in fact, Abuna Aragawi in particular, and actually Abuna Garima. Garima in particular is a saint that St. Jared himself sang about. And so St. Jared himself is a great saint, but then he sang also about some other saints. And they're in that category, these 9 Greco-Syrian saints of people that St. Jared would have sung about. And he would have been the mentee of these saints.
Now, concerning St. Moses Evangelos, this part of his story jumped out at me because it also reminds me of what St. Joseph the Hesychast dealt with over the same sin, which is St. Moses fought against a literal demon, which was afflicting him with lust. And then St. Isidore blessed him to commune anyway. And so what's the significance of this? What's the teaching of we're supposed to draw from this part of the hagiography, you feel?
Well, the background of this is that after St. Moses adopted the monastic life and he became an ascetic, he was afflicted with this particular passion. And at first, he received different advice from different elders about how to deal with it. And the first elder he spoke to told him to fast continuously and very strictly, because he goes, once you cut off the food that excites the body, then that will help you curb this passion. And he did that, but eating just dry rusks and water, and it didn't work. So then he went to a second elder, and this elder advised him to spend his days and nights in vigils, standing up and praying. And he did that as well, trying to tire out. That didn't work either. So then finally, as you say, he was then afterwards he would he was a bit despondent, so he didn't know what to do. So he goes, I will just help my other brothers, and he would carry water for them to their individual cells, because in that part of Egypt especially, it was very arid, so it was some way off to carry water, and some of the older monks couldn't make it. So as he was doing this act of mercy, he was attacked, and then by this demonic force, and then he was brought into the house of the abbot to recover. And it was at that point that he was allowed to receive communion. So I think that the message is that ultimately, and this is something also, there's a very similar story in the life of Saint Nihilus of Rossano in Calabria that we translated, where there's something similar that occurs with the passion of lust. The idea is that ultimately we cannot free ourselves of these things. We're too weak to do this ourselves. So everything comes through the grace of God and us cooperating with it. So it's not that we're ever worthy enough to receive Holy Communion, but it is a gift that God gives us to strengthen us. But obviously, absolutely, we have to approach it with reverence, like St. Moses did in repentance. But I think it shows that the strength, my power is made strong in weakness, as the psalm says. So that's what the story is about.
On that point, may I ask you too about your liturgy?
Sure.
Yeah. So in our liturgy, right before communion, in the beginning of the liturgy, we say one is the Father, one, or only the Father is holy, only the Son is holy, as only the Holy Spirit is holy. But then it's repeated right before communion, and then we say Kyrie eleison. We say Lord have mercy. They say the Jesus prayer. Do you have that in there in your liturgy? Because that I think gets to the point that you just said, that nobody is worthy except he who says he's not worthy.
We say is Aios, is Kyrios. Yes. When is that? When is that said? I think it's right before the consecration of the Eucharist.
Yes, that's
chanted, right? Yeah.
One is holy, one's the Lord Jesus Christ. Glory to God the Father, right?
Yeah.
It's it's what stuck out to me, that teaching about St. Moses the Black, was twofold, which is, apart from the grace of God, we could do nothing. Right. So for everything he was laboring for, whether with fasting, whether with ceaseless prayer, whether with acts of mercy, right, good works, that all these things are good, but they're powerless without the grace of God. And so the grace of God is what affects everything in the situation. And so that obviously humbles us. It's not to dissuade us from doing all these good things, but to put us in a place, understand that apart from the grace of God, we could do absolutely nothing to overcome the passions. I think the other thing that jumped out at me anyway was that through an act of obedience, right? Spiritual father tells him, do this. Humbly says, yes. And the act of obedience outdoes all of his acts, all his good works, and all of his really faithfulness. And it reminds me of a quote of St. Joseph the Hesychast. He said about those under spiritual care, that through a year or two of obedience, they have gained I got from decades of asceticism. And so obedience is the highest virtue, because Christ was obedient unto death. And this is something that's very often obviously lacking, I would say, in the Western Christian theological paradigm, but not lacking in the patristic and hagiographic witness.
Amen.
So that being said, we have this teaching from St. Moses that stuck out to me. Do no evil, to any man, nor think anything evil in your heart against anyone. Do not condemn anyone who does evil. So my question is, why do none of us listen to this?
Deacon,
We
do
got
you have
no, we
any
got no
thoughts on
answer.
that?
It just shows we're sinful. I don't know. Is there another answer to that?
I think we got to keep hearing the teaching until it sinks in. I would say it's the same reason that we got the repetition in there. I always love, and I see on social media people share his quote about fasting, and he talks about how even demons fast. But it goes back to your point. It's obedience. It's humility that the demons are not capable of emulating.
Oh yeah, they could fast all day. They've been fasting for thousands of years. So let's talk about St Pantaleon. He was silent as an ascetic feat, amongst allegedly not eating nor sleeping. So what is the significance of silence in particular, and how's that poignant today?
Well, he was a stylite, actually. So even more than a regular ascetic, he sealed himself in on top of a mountain and just prayed continuously, like Saint Simeon the Stylite in Syria. And yeah, so it's interesting that one of the things he fasted from, it says in this story that he not only did he sit atop this mountain praying, but he closed himself in a cell so that his eyes could not feast on the beauty of creation, and his ears could not listen to the sound of the birds and the glory of God's creation. And he even fasted from speaking, and all he would do would be just to weep for his sins and continually remember the coming judgment. And I think the message there, or one of the messages, is when someone reaches a true state of repentance, and really they're filled with this overwhelming love to give back to God, but ultimately God, everything we have is from God. So the way that we show that is through renunciation of what we have, to show that we give up something to show our love for God. And yes, silence is very important in the hesychastic tradition. God is revealed in silence, as even St Dionysius the Areopagite says very early on. When someone is chattering and has too many idle thoughts in their mind, it doesn't leave much space for God and for pious reflections.
Yeah, I would add to that to say our tradition is very Alexandrine and Antiochian, and so very much of the Egyptian desert and the Syrian desert. These are our two great contexts from which we developed in Aksum, and we drew from both traditions as we pleased. The bishopry is obviously Alexandrine, but a lot of the monastic stuff comes from both, and the literature especially is very Antiochian, especially the patristics. And in those writings and in that history, all the way going back to Saint Anthony, who I like to remind people was a lay monk, was not a priest, but was a lay monk. And these are different callings. They are often together as the hiero monk, but they don't necessarily have to be. And we still have this tradition in Ethiopia of lay monks, often married couples who, once the fire is out of them, they'll choose monasticism, or people like the great Saint Kaleb, who
So after 10 years of marriage.
People like Saint Kaleb, who will achieve their vow of saving and rescuing Christians, and then pursue monasticism, giving up the throne. I'm a direct descendant of the funny great Ethiopian Catholic king, who there was a massacre of people fighting over whether Ethiopia would be Catholic or not. He saw it was a bad idea, and so he repented of that idea, and he went and became a monk as well. So there's like this long tradition of people who do that. I want to remind, these are part of the 9 Greco-Syrian saints who we mentioned earlier. And I would say in the liturgy, we actually abhor silence. And so if there's ever a moment of silence, they'll always fill it with some reading of some patristic text. But outside of the context of the liturgy, silence is a very, very powerful tool in the toolkit of holiness and perfection in our tradition. And I would say, especially for those of us who are not allergic to reading, we're filled with so much knowledge that the hardest thing for us to do is to be silent, and so it's a great practice.
That's a good point, and I have no wisdom as to have silence because I lack this. But let me ask this before we continue St Pantaleon, because we mentioned St Dionysius, and we know that Alexandria had such an important import upon Ethiopian Orthodoxy. Does St Dionysius of the Areopagite ever come up in any context in Ethiopia, or not really?
So, yeah, it's very interesting that you said that. There was a reading during Passion Week. So during Passion Week, we read everything, and so there was a reading during Passion Week where I heard his name come up, and I don't know a ton about him, to be frank. I don't hear a lot about him from our tradition, but there was something during Passion Week that I did hear that was attributed to him.
So he's somewhere there in the readings of the church, but not a huge figure. Now, let me ask this to Evangelos. Why was St. Pantaleon venerated in the West when he's reputed to be one of the 9 saints who were allegedly non-Chalcedonian? Why did Rossini translate his life, and would we have really known about him otherwise?
So it's interesting because in the Ethiopian tradition, he's referred to as St Pantaleon, which would be a version of the Greek word Pantaleon, which means all merciful. But in the martyrdom of St Aretheus, in the chapter that talks about King Kaleb sailing over to Yemen to avenge the death of the Christians, there's a scene where he visits a stylite to get his blessing. And then based on the comparison essentially of the two texts, this seems to be the same person that's referred to in the life of St Pantaleon. But there he's referred to as Abba Zonenos. So he's given a different name. So perhaps he had multiple names, or tradition just gave him this title of Pantaleon because he was merciful to people. We don't know. But in there it says that he was a Roman from the city of Ela, which is the ancient name of Aqaba in Jordan. Which is interesting because that would seem to point to a more Alexandrian or Egyptian Middle Eastern origin as opposed to Syrian or Mesopotamian one that the Deacon Henok referred to before. The Italian editor that you mentioned, Rossini, he was active in the late 19th and early 20th century when there was that Italian colonial influence in Ethiopia. So I think he was approaching the question more from a archaeologist standpoint, interested in these texts. So there's no reference, at least that I found, that this particular saint had a appointed feast day or commemoration in the outside of Ethiopia. Just apart from that reference in the life of St Aretheus, in which he's referred to as a holy stylite and a man of God. But then that opens the question of what is the dating and the origin of these 9 saints, which is something I tried as best as I could in the literature I had to find. So in the life of St Pantaleon, there is, in the ending of the life, some chronological cue that is given, and it said that he died in the year 530 AD after serving as a stylite for 45 years in Ethiopia, which would place his arrival in 485, which is several decades before the persecution, the Justinianic persecution in Syria began. And there are other points of correspondence that seem to agree on this late 5th century date, at least from the historical sources. Most notably, you have the Alexandrian chronographer Cosmas, who visited Ethiopia in the 520s, and he already says that the country was filled with monastics and Christians and martyrs already at that date. So that would seem to point out to a bit of an earlier period of evangelism in the kingdom of Aksum then is later assumed by the historiography.
All right. Now, surrounding the story of the martyrdom of St. Aretheus, because we've been mentioning him several times, is a Jewish kingdom from Arabia persecuting the Ethiopians. So, like modern day Yemen used to be all Jewish. And it's interesting because they appeared to be the descendants of actually apostatized Christians of an Arian persuasion from a earlier evangelization in the 4th century. So my question about this group of people that ended up persecuting the Ethiopians, would their is this an accurate synopsis of what we know about their history, and would their children's children end up becoming the Muslims? So I don't know if you have any opinion on that, Deacon Henok.
So I don't know a ton about the apostatized Arianism. I know paganism was still very strong at the time. And you remember the Kaaba and that whole area, like the dominant cities in Mecca and Medina and all these places are still very pagan at this time. There was an Aksumite presence after the rescuing of them for like 50 years. And so I think my understanding is that more than apostatized Arianism, paganism was more widespread in the region, but he converted to Judaism, and then he had like this Jewish kingdom that was persecuting Christians. The Aksumites take it over for like 50 years, but St. Kaleb is not managing it because he then takes his vow of monasticism, goes back. There's some leadership change even amongst the Christians. And then the Sasanian Persians, who were Zoroastrians, come. And it was the Sasanians who overthrowed them and severed our connection to that side of the Red Sea for centuries, really. And then the rise of Islam overtakes the Sasanian Zoroastrian Persians. And so eventually they did become Muslim, but there might have been a short period where they were at least ruled by Zoroastrian. I don't know if any of them became Zoroastrian, but they were ruled by the Zoroastrians for a while as well. And then eventually, yes, it did become Muslim. But by the way, to this day in that area, there are still Yemeni Jews, a very small fraction, especially in the highlands. And the most fascinating thing about the genetic information is that those Jewish Yemeni seem to be the most real Yemeni people, because on the lowlands of Yemen, they always have trace Aksumite or Ethiopian ancestry in their DNA, which the opposite is not true. Often they think that we're just Yemenis mixed with East Africans. We are something, but I think it's more Mesopotamian or Levantine, not exactly Yemeni. And in the opposite, our African side is found in them, except for the highland Jews. Mm-hmm. And most of those highland Jews have since, in the 20th century, emigrated to the state of Israel.
Well, it's I just find this interesting because my wife's theory is that Native Americans in North and South America originate from Southeast Asia. And if you look at just how they look, I did no gene research. It just, when I first was dating my wife, she's like, I think Cambodians maybe started the Americas. And we just look at a face, I was like, well, maybe they came over canoes. I don't know, because they do look similar. Because I'm not sure how much I believe in that land bridge. But that being said, it's Evangelos, you sometimes have hot takes on history. This Jewish kingdom, were these people historically pagans, and the ruling class became Arian Christian, then the ruling class became Jewish, and then the same ruling class became Orthodox for a little while, and then they became Muslims? Is this kind of like the story of the people there, or is that an accurate synopsis in your view?
I think that we have records of the ruling class in the 5th century converting to Judaism, and then that led to an en masse conversion of the peoples there. So they're not historically Israelites, let's say. They're more like the Khazars who converted later on. But they seem to have taken like the Judaism very much to heart, because they were we have records even in the 5th century of them persecuting some of the Christian missionaries. As far as the Arian mission goes, it sort of just falls off the map. So I would think that it wasn't really an important factor. In the saints' lives of the period, there are references to Nestorianism, which was more prominent on the in the Persian Gulf side, so the opposite of the Red Sea. And then later in Islam, there are these apocryphal elements and heterodox ideas that are found in Islam, which go back to early Christian heresies, even some Gnostic heresies. So it was probably some type of melting pot of beliefs there, and then that's how these things made their way into Islam in its final form. And an interesting little thing I found was in this inscription we referred to in our introduction. This was discovered in the 20th century in Yemen, and it records literally the Jewish king's victory over the Nadranites, and after having killed them and sold them into slavery, some of his commanders wrote this inscription on a rock to commemorate the occasion. And it ends after they name all the spoils that they acquired. They say, "Might Rahmanan," meaning the merciful one, bless their sons, meaning the sons of the commanders of Dunuas's army. And then they put the date, the month, Madra'an of the Sabaean era, 633, which would be AD 523. And it's been remarked that title that they use to refer to God, Rahmanan, the merciful one, it's one of the main titles of Allah in the Islamic tradition, Al-Rahman. So it seems that a lot of these Arabian Jews converted en masse to Islam, and that's where a lot of these traditions and beliefs came from, was from this community that was adopted by Muhammad and later the Arabs of that period.
Now, the life of St. Aretheus is so interesting because it's apparently very contemporary. How do we know that's the case?
So it was the life of St. Aretheus was written in Greek, probably during the reign of Justinian, and it might even have had a propagandistic or ecumenical reason for it to have been written, because at the time Justinian was trying to reconcile the Severian faction with the church in Constantinople. So appealing to these common saints, I think, would have been one way that he did that. The Greek text is based on three primary sources. One is a lost source about the campaign, King Kaleb's campaign in Arabia, which isn't found anywhere else. So this life, ironically, it's one of our main historical sources for this war as well. And then the two other sources were these Syriac documents that were written by this Syrian bishop who was in the court of one of the Arabian vassal states in Mesopotamia when Dunuas, who was the Jewish Arabian king, had just started persecuting the Christians, and he sent letters to the court of this other Arabian king, encouraging him to do the same and sort of boasting of what he had done. And then, given that this Syriac bishop was present, he heard news of this, and then he got later more information from eyewitnesses, and he collected these in some documents. One is called the Book of the Himyarites, and another was a letter that he wrote to another bishop from the region. And then these were then used as sources or translated for the Greek life. So if the martyrdom happened in 523, the Greek life was written at the latest in 560, 570. So it's within 50 years of the event.
What I find interesting, at least according to W.H.M. Friend, is that southern Egypt, Sudan, and I can't remember what the book says about Ethiopia specifically, but that these areas of Africa had quite a lot of interchange with Constantinople proper, and were actually in communion with Constantinople far longer into the 7th century, 8th century even. And so this may imply, like you're saying, the reason behind writing such a work roughly contemporary, because this was part of a purposeful diplomatic program to perhaps maintain trading ties and political ties with Ethiopia and those parts of Africa. Now, I want to ask you, Deacon Henok, how did the Byzantine Empire and King Kaleb put an end to this Jewish persecution and invasion? And in your view, do you feel that the role of the Byzantine Empire is exaggerated?
Well, exaggerated, I don't know. It depends exactly what you're saying happened. And Justinian is such an interesting figure. I have kind of more mixed feelings and emotions about him. A lot of my Miaphysite brethren online have a lot of vitriol about him because he's seen as the one who used the Eastern Roman imperial power to kind of persecute and drive away the Miaphysites, treating them like the Arians. And obviously, we don't view ourselves like the Arians. But it's complicated because of what you're saying regarding seeking a ecumenism and seeking a unity. And the greatest complexity is that his wife Theodora is very remembered very fondly by the Miaphysites because she was a great lover of the Miaphysites. And figures like Jacob Bar Adai and Pope Theodosius I, the last universally recognized by non-Chalcedonian and Chalcedonian people, the Patriarch of Alexandria, or Pope, as it's called, the Pope of Alexandria. We always mention 50 years or several decades before the Pope of Rome, or the Bishop of Rome was called Pope, the Pope of Alexandria was called Pope. And we still call Pope Theodorus II Pope today. But it's complicated because there were letters exchanged back and forth. There were calls of bringing troops together to kind of unite against them. And then there was a possibility to unite also against the Persians, the Sassanians. But none of those collaborations actually took place. Whether they were ignored, whether they were lost in transit, it's very hard to determine. So I don't know how involved people say they are to say that it's exaggerated, but I would say it's minimal, but they were certainly communicating with one another. There just wasn't a lot of like cooperation in troop movement. This is a very horrible analogy, but going back to the World War II analysis, the way in which the Allied powers were collaborating is not the way in which the Axis powers were collaborating. If you see the way the Germans, Italians, and Japanese were kind of collaborating in World War II, they didn't really work together. They just kind of had an in-name alliance, and then everybody was kind of doing their own thing. And so I think
Italy invaded Greece. What?
I think the Byzantine
and then the Germans had to come and mop up.
I think the Byzantines and the Aksumites of this early period, like, were kind of friendly to each other and were interested in reunion and debating and stuff, but they didn't really cooperate in like a strategic military battle. Saint Kaleb pretty much did it all on his own. But it would have been nice. It's even like the purview of the ecumenical councils. The Persian Empire, which Evangelos mentioned earlier, contained a lot of people which today are the Assyrian Church of the East. And they basically accept the first two councils. And even that, like even Nicaea and Constantinople, like 80 to 100 years after the councils take place, as a kind of cool thing. And the Ethiopian presence is really not so clear at this time at any of the ecumenical councils, but we're of course represented by the Copts, who were, because all of the purview of the ecumenical councils, as Subdeacon Dan would often tell you, are within the Roman Empire, and all that's taking place within there. Aksum as its own empire, and the Syrian Church of the East, which was in the Persian Empire, were kind of in different areas and would accept and or reject different councils based off of that. But the main collaboration is, I think, that they all had a common enemy in a Jewish king who was killing Christians, and in the Sassanian Zoroastrians, or the Persians as well. And of course, later with the rise of Islam, the various Muslim kingdoms or states.
Now, St. Kaleb, is he remembered kind of like St. Constantine would be for the Eastern Orthodox? How big in the Mount Rushmore of Ethiopian Orthodoxy is St. Kaleb?
To be frank, I've never heard him referred in our tradition as saint, but I don't think anyone would have a problem. They usually remember him as emperor. They usually say emperor, and that's not for lack of saint kings. We had a whole Zagwe dynasty from the fall of Aksum around the 900s till about the 1200s when there was that regime change I mentioned, where we have people like Lalibela, Saint Lalibela, Saint Nakutolab, a lot of people who were priest kings. And I think this is the mythos behind the famous Prester John in European history,
Yeah.
and the search for the Grail and the search for the Ark of the Covenant that are all connected. Like we had priest kings. Kaleb wasn't a priest. He was later a monk, but he wasn't a priest. And so I don't often hear about his sainthood. Maybe others might know more about that, but he's definitely well known, and it's a very common name. My mother wanted to name me Kaleb, actually, but my dad ended up wanting to name me Enoch because he's Elias or Elijah. Elias is, of course, the Greek way. Elijah is the Hebrew way. And those are the two saints that never died. And so my dad, who never goes to church, still wanted a very church name for me.
There you go. That's pretty cool. Evangelos, looked like you were going to say something.
Yes, yeah, because the Deacon Enoch reminded me of something I had wanted to ask him. Okay, could you explain this weird historical flip that happened? I can't seem to find any information on it. When we're talking about the Nestorians and the Church of the East, traditionally the Malankara Church in India is held to have been of that grouping, and then in the 15th or 16th century, they switched to the right, like the non-Chalcedonian, the Alexandrian Coptic communion, which it's like a 180 in belief. So, do you have any information of like what happened there, or what was going on in the Middle Ages? Who were they in communion with?
I do. It's a very convoluted history, and I'm not an expert on this. I know just a little bit of this because they are in our communion. But this is often why when I speak of our communion, I usually go Alexandria, and also for the alliteration's sake, I usually say Alexandria, Antioch, Aksum, and Armenia. It's great. It's all A's, and it's very clear. And those were from the beginning. From the 4th century, it was those four. What happened is exactly as you said. So the so-called Nestorians, it's always funny, right? They say Nestorius himself wasn't Nestorian sometimes, but they do use the title Mar Nestorius to this day. And of course, Mar is like we say Mar Isaac. It means Lord in the Syriac. So Lord Nestorius is a crazy thing to say. But they have them in the diptychs, but whether they're actually Nestorian or not is actually hotly debated. But the Assyrian Church of the East, which is their endonym, themselves, they have a little bit of a split with that famous guy in Australia, Marmari Emmanuel, who was stabbed in the eye by a militant Islamist and survived, if you remember. And he's very popular online. So they have slight schisms within themselves as well. But to speak of the Assyrian Church of the East, basically everything east of the Roman Empire was evangelized. First, of course, by the Apostle Thomas, but later by the Assyrian Church of the East. And that's the liturgical rite, which is another way of saying that when I refer to each communion from west to east by their liturgical language, I call Protestants Germanics because all of Protestantism happens in Germanic languages. I call the Roman Catholic Church Latins. I call you all Greeks, even though you have Slavs, because Greek is the main rite. Us Afro-Asiatics, because it begins in Alexandria and Antioch, initially with some Greek, but eventually Coptic and Syriac, and later Ge'ez. And Armenian, even though it's Indo-European, Armenia is in West Asia, and so it's still Afro-Asiatic. Then the East Syriac. So we have the West Syriac, and they have the East Syriac. And so the East Syriac evangelized all the way to China and Mongolia. So even the court of Kublai Khan, right, one of his wives or concubines, whatever we're calling them, was a woman of the Church of the East. And so there was a presence there that the Mongols and the Chinese destroyed over time. It was hard for Christianity to have that foothold in China and the rest of Asia as an exclusive religion. As a syncretized religion, they're like, no problem. Exclusive religion, it was difficult for them. When it comes to India, of course, had many different kingdoms within it. It was Assyrian Church of the East till the 1600s. What happened in the 1600s is the age of exploration, is that the Europeans came, and particularly like the Portuguese on the west side, establishing Goa and other places, colonized the Indians for like 50 to 60 years or more. And so they imposed Catholicism on these people who were Assyrian Church of the East or East Syriac liturgically. In that chaos, a lot of things happened. And to this day, you'll see this even right now as they're choosing a new pope, Bishop of Rome. You see in the conclave, the many people there, people are thinking that they get confused when people are chanting Christos Anesti. Those aren't Orthodox. Those are the Melkite Catholics. And then you see the Syro-Malabar Indians, right? Who some people confused also for Eastern Orthodox, but they're Catholics within that. So because of the Portuguese and because of the age of exploration, because of European colonialism in India, there was an initial break where a group of these Christians became Catholic. And through that, their connection to the Church of the East was severed, I think permanently. And so because of that severing, there began to be two traditions within the Catholic Church of a West Syriac and an East Syriac within it's all in the state of Kerala, by the way, which is called the Malabar Coast. It's also called the state of Kerala. Malankara is their endonym for their ethnic group. So it has these three names: the Malabar Coast, the state of Kerala, Kerala, and then the Malankara is their ethnic group name. Their language is Malayalam. Okay, and so they all share that, but there's a West Syriac and East Syriac under the purview of Rome, who acknowledge the Bishop of Rome. And then they tried to reestablish with us contact in the 1600s. They connected with the West Syriac Antiochians, or the Syriac Orthodox Church, and they began to be under them for about 300 years. And then this is where I don't know the history as well, but in the early 1900s, now you have British colonialism, or initially it was Portuguese, now you have British colonialism, with confusion in that and Anglicanism popping up. And now you get some of them who become Anglican, so it splits them up even further. And these are millions of Christians. Remember how big India is, the biggest country on earth population-wise. But with the confusion brought by the British and the colonialism, a new split happened where now even within our communion, we have the Malankara Orthodox who declared autocephaly without permission after all of this confusion, and then and who say they're in communion with us. And then we have who are called the Jacobites, referring to Jacob from the period we were talking about earlier, Bardai, thank you, or Bardaeus from earlier. And that refers to those Indian Christians who are Oriental Orthodox, but who only have a Catholicos or Metropolitan, the way the Ethiopians and Armenians, much briefer in Armenia, but we used to have. And they acknowledged the patriarch of Antioch, More Ephraim Ignatius, as their patriarch. And so it's very convoluted, but they are now within that one group that was originally East Syriac. There are Anglicans, there are Pentecostals, there are two types of Catholics, and two types of Oriental Orthodox.
Wow.
And now we can see how evil schisms are, because the confusion it creates. How much harder is it going to be to reconcile these disparate bodies, and they're becoming dozens of different bodies. So let me ask this question, because it's kind of on that note and it's mysterious, but I want your react first, Deacon Henok, and then Evangelos. If you have any opinions, they're definitely welcome. But why is St. John of Damascus a saint for Ethiopians on December 17th? I forget, there's different days and months by how it looks when you read the synaxarion. I also saw Peter Damascus, who I'm guessing it's the rough contemporary, because there's another 12th century Peter Damascus. Luke the Stylite has 2 days in this the Ethiopian synaxarion. Theodore of Jerusalem, which is a 8th century Iconodule, or the 10th century Syriac Orthodox bishop. Obviously, neither are in the Eastern Orthodox synaxarion. And Stephen II of Antioch, who's a Chalcedonian martyr. What's the deal with some of these surprising saints, if you have any opinion?
I have a little bit about it, and then I'll let Evangelos say more. We also have other people from the Assyrian Church of the East. For example, we have a book called Masafa Manokosat, which is the Book of Monks in Ge'ez and in Amharic, interpreted like the Targum tradition that was in Yemen with Hebrew and Aramaic. And the Book of Monks is actually exclusively Church of the East monks. And in fact, it's very funny. Our monks sometimes will say, and I've had monks say this to me, don't read this book. But also we have this book, and then it makes you want to read this book, right? And in that book, you have Mar Isaac, who's St. Isaac the Syrian.
Yep.
And then it also has John Saba, the spiritual elder. And then it has someone who's attributed as Philoxenus, but there's a current scholar right now doing scholarship that says it's actually not Philoxenus, who would have been West Syriac and within us, but it's actually another Church of the East person that was used pseudonymously as Philoxenus, who was more West Syriac. And I'd say, I think it's the same reason we have the 81 book canon. I wrote an article about that, by the way. There's a lot of AI slop nowadays saying that there are 88 books. We don't have that many books, right? It's 81, only 81, not 88.
Why do you say slop like it's a bad thing?
I say slop
I mean in the kindest of ways.
Yeah, I say AI slop because there are people literally using AI to translate books, and I don't know the quality of them, but I've seen them a lot on X, formerly Twitter, as well as on Amazon. And it's frustrating because I keep getting people asking me whether the Ethiopian church Bible has been translated into English. There's no official translation. There are a lot of ways you can get around it. If you have an NKJV New Testament. I mean, my preferred is Father Laurent Cleanworks Greek Orthodox Bible. He's in your communion, and I've communicated with him in the past about potentially doing an audio version. But I really love that translation. But people like the Orthodox Study Bible, NKG, whatever, for the New Testament. For the Old Testament, there are several fine. I prefer Lexham, but there are several fine Septuagint translations into English that I think you can get at, and then. The Lexham one has the Book of Enoch in it. You could find Jubilees elsewhere from G.B. Huntingford, which I believe Evangelos used for the story of the cannibal within this Saints of Ethiopia as well. And
thank you for the reference, by the way. I'm going to add in a new edition. I'll put a footnote for the divergent reading.
Yes, so he's referring to the group at Princeton have the Miracles of Mary project with my friend Mahadi, whose name, by the way, it's the reverse consonantally of the Araman, the mercy that you were saying. It means merciful one. Is weird from Semitic languages. We read left to right. Every other Semitic language is right to left. And so it's MHR in our language. And in all the other Semitic languages, it's RHM. Ruhama, you find
so you
as
guys
well.
Fixed it. You don't do that.
Yes, we fixed it. Or we're the original and they switched it, right? The same way that we match the way we do the sign of the cross with the Catholics. And I think my pet theory about you guys is that you were watching the priest do it, and then you did the reverse of what the priest did when you did the sign of the cross.
Everyone else screwed it up but us. That's our view.
But yeah, sorry, I lost the train of thought, but we were saying about
the surprising saints like Luke the Stylite.
Yes.
So like, right, it's not like by mistake, like, because I think there's some Oriental Orthodox, generally Syriac and Coptic, they said, these are corruptions and whatnot. But like Luke the Stylite gets in twice. There seems to be
I don't think it's a
purpose.
corruption. I think the mentality of our fathers was not a rigorous mentality of like, this doesn't fit all the stuff on paper, let's throw it out. I think they judged each text on its merits and just were very insatiably curious to find materials and patristics from all over Christendom, and they did this stuff. I think you mentioned and I've heard other people mention the communities that have been in Jerusalem since the 4th century, and then we've had monks that went to, I think, either Florence or Trent or one of the Roman councils. When they're traveling abroad, especially, I think they just see, how are Christians here doing it, and had a kind of de facto ecumenism. It doesn't mean they shared the Eucharist together, but that they were interested in the steps that you could take
within
outside
the
of that.
Ethiopian ethos, there's an ecumenism before ecumenism, if that makes sense to say.
Yeah, I think so. I think they were extremely open-minded to the reception of any sort of Christian texts, and that they used it for their own purposes, like a buffet of Christendom.
Very interesting. Evangelos, I don't know if you have any opinions.
Not much, but I'll share something I discovered this week. There's this writer from the school of Nisibis. So he's officially part of the Syriac Nestorian tradition. His name was Henana of Adiabini. And what's interesting is that he died in 610, but he actually accepted the Council of Chalcedon and rejected the idea that Christ, the the human nature of Christ was a distinct person, and then he was eventually excommunicated by his communion for that. But it was interesting to see that even almost like 200 years after the Council of Ephesus, there were still people officially who were not in communion with the church, but that were still receptive to these doctrines. So it and then when you take that in together with Emperor Justinian's attempts with the Fifth Ecumenical Council to reconcile everybody, that seems to point to the fact that maybe officially people weren't in communion, but on a ground level they were much more receptive, especially as Deacon Henok said, in terms of the Western Syriac and Eastern Syriac tradition. There was a shared type of like liturgy and monastic tradition, which made people interact from these different groups, and then that might explain some of those saints who ended up in the synaxarion.
It's I have the hottest take of the bunch, and my personal view is there's a modern bias to read in present and contemporary day divisions into the past, and it doesn't mean those divisions didn't have any analogous existence in the past, but it then magnifies and exaggerates, and it's hard not to see it because you're reading it in the present. And this is a challenge for historians to try kind of deconstruct those modern biases when reading ancient sources. The second crucial issue is that even ancient sources usually aren't contemporary at the same time and place. They could be a century or two removed or from particular partisans, where then that could create a sort of bias, which then affects where even a honest interpretation of the history of us in the present, reading the sources that we have, could have distortions. I find like the source you mentioned in passing, it was a surprise for you, Evangelos, something that surprised me. I forget which letter of St Photius, but he speaks matter-of-factly about a union that was recently affected with the Armenians.
The Armenians, yeah.
Yes, and we have another letter from St Photius where he's writing the Armenian Patriarch, where that union apparently did not yet occur because he's trying to convince him, or Catholicos, or however exactly that works. And so we don't really read this a lot about in history. I'm sorry, Evangelos, yes. Yeah,
right on that point. Even later on in the 16th century, we have Patriarch Jeremias of Constantinople, who's famous with his for his interaction with the Lutherans in the 1580s. There's correspondence that survives where he's writing to the Armenians again, and this was in the context of the Gregorian reform of the Easter date, and then he's writing letters to the Armenians where he's citing the history of how Christianity spread to Armenia and the First Ecumenical Council and what the canon of Easter is and how it should be kept. So, and then also his contemporary Saint Meletios Pigas, who's the Melkite Patriarch of Alexandria, he also wrote to the Coptics, and there is a reference I found that he also wrote to the Ethiopians, but I haven't confirmed that. And then he was basically in this period of intense evangelism from the Jesuits in the East. He took an approach where he was reaching out to these other groups and encouraging them to stick to the existing tradition and not change to the Gregorian calendar.
And hence, right, this would imply that he saw them as part of his camp, so to say. And Deacon Henok was speaking about St. Isaac the Syrian. And an interesting thing is St. Isaac the Syrian, for good or bad reasons, could have authentically been within a communion that included Rome, Constantinople, Severians in Alexandria, and presumably Ethiopia, because they have been getting their metropolitans from those same moderate Severians. And so a lot of people will say, well, here is this saint that is Nestorian, but they look past the fact there was a union that was affected during the reign of Heraclius, and it's unclear where this was synodically rejected. And so this could have really put a lot of those saints authentically within Orthodox communion, Roman communion, Ethiopian communion, and may explain how some of these saints find themselves in each other's communion. So I guess my hot take is this: which is the final division, tragically, between Oriental Orthodox in all counts, right? This would be Ethiopia, India, and all this, Armenia, and let's say Eastern Orthodox, could be the final, could be much later than people really realize, because of the fact that what happens in India, as Deacon Henok says, is that when persecuted by the Roman Catholics and by these Western Europeans, these persecutions and institutional reforms are much more deliberate and intricate, kind of forced them into the Western Syriac arms, and they became Jacobites, so to say. In the same way, what happens with Ethiopia, just to, again, all the politics and the Portuguese in Ethiopia, which we didn't touch on, but that was a problem as well, may have, I speculate, because I'm not an expert in this era of history, thrust them more intricately into the arms of the Alexandrians and the Copts. When before then, there could have been a more broad back and forth. So what I'm not saying is they were tried and true Chalcedonians with no reservations, because I don't think that's the case either, but that there could have been these intermittent communion and reconciliation, which may explain how these saints kind of get their way into the Ethiopian synaxarion. And it should be said, for example, like St. John of Damascus, while some of these saints are just mentioned in passing, St. John of Damascus has a whole reading, and nowhere in the reading is there anything about his Christology, for obvious reasons, because this could be a major point of contention. And so in the hagiographic gloss in the Ethiopian synaxarion of St. John of Damascus emphasizes particularly his holiness and his defense of icons, which would be meaningful to the Ethiopian hagiographic tradition. So again, just very interesting and really needs serious scholarship to hone in on. I just find a great topic, and it's probably a real grace to all of us that this may be the first time in the English language discourse that a lot of people are going to hear this. So that is something that I'm grateful for, to be part of that. So before we do audience questions, I want to give you guys any last comments you like to say on the book or the topic, and any plugs. So first, Deacon Henok.
Yeah, on this last point, I think this intermittent thing that you're saying it's very interesting and possible. On the point of the Armenians, they always baffle me. The fact that they didn't go with you all and that they stayed with us is really incredible. When I'm actually a geography teacher, when you look at the geography, because they're not contiguous. Like, they're in West Asia, but they're not really contiguous with us. Syria, Egypt, Ethiopia has like no Chalcedonians in between, and so it's more contiguous, and it kind of makes more sense. It was the Syriac that originally evangelized Armenia and gave them autocephaly very early, unlike the autocephaly that we got, which was very late. And then they also evangelized the Georgians. We have to speak of the Caucasus together. And it's very fascinating, because the rest of the Caucasus today are Muslim, and that's that Dagestan, Chechnya part of Russia. But the kind of lower Caucasus beneath or south of Chechnya and Dagestan is Armenia and Georgia. And the Georgians were with us until about, I think, the 7th or 8th century. Don't quote me on that, back that up. And then they made a decision to just switch over and be within the kind of like the great power of Russia, to use a Mearsheimer phrase, right? And they merged with the larger Chalcedonian communion. But the Armenians were stalwarts that didn't do that, it's a very strange when you look at it. And I've never myself gotten an answer to the mystery as to why they didn't just join
They're a
your
stubborn
side.
Mountain people. They don't want to be subjugated by the Turks or by the Russians. And so it makes sense to attach yourself to the group of people that's not going to dominate you.
That makes sense.
I
yeah.
think.
Yeah.
It makes all the sense in the world.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah. And allowed them their autocephaly, like I said, very early on. I think we did all the good plugs. If you remember nothing else, aksum.substack.com and aksum.gumroad with a KS rather than an X. It's spelled both ways, but I like it more KS.
There you go. If you could imagine a space between com and Aksum, you have the spelling of the website right there. And like I said, we will add those as a sticky thread if the show is done. Evangelos, any comments? And again, plugs.
Yeah, I would just say I really enjoyed working on this particular book. I learned a lot, and I think you guys have a really beautiful, beautiful tradition and reverence to your saints. So for anyone who wants to get the book, I believe the link will be in the description, and it's you could also visit our website, scriptoriumpress.ca. We have some other offerings and some other things we'll be publishing, God willing, at the end of the summer, early autumn.
Oh, if I may, one more thing that Evangelos and I were joking about on X goes to another thing that, Craig, you were mentioning. Someone misattributed this quote of C.S. Lewis to St. Athanasius of Alexandria, whom we've mentioned many times today.
Yeah,
and I knew it immediately.
AI slap.
Yeah, but I read it because I know I know how the confusion happened. I immediately understood because there are many translations, like St. Vlad's has their own, but in one of the online translations available for free of On the Incarnation by St. Athanasius, which was originally written in Greek, the introduction is written by C.S. Lewis. And he says exactly what you said. How to get rid of the bias of every age is by reading books from different time periods. And so you should get to know what the zeitgeist or the ghost of your age is and the ghost of each age is, so that you could fight against it and combat it by switching off every book you read from different centuries.
See, we like Germany. We used one of their words. My plug again is orthodoxchristiantheology.com/donate to support the missions Cambodia. If this show has blessed you, like, subscribe, share, please pray for all of us here. Your prayers mean really more than anything else. And pray for the mission in Cambodia. If you can materially support it, that'd be very much appreciated. Again, just a $10 donation makes available a saint life in the Khmer language that's never been translated before into the Cambodian tongue. We are also helping repair the it's like the wall that protects the church in Sihanoukville. We need $4,500. So a larger donation, $100 donation, might be crazy and donate a big amount of money. That'd be very much appreciated because it helps preserve the investment that the original founders of the church made. It costs about $250,000. It prevents break-ins. It's very much appreciated, the small support you give for this. And if you can't give any money, that is fine. Your prayers are also very much appreciated. Links to Venmo, PayPal, most importantly, and also Patreon, if you want to be a monthly supporter, are all below. And so your support, your prayers are very much appreciated. And I want to ask everyone listening to this, consider and pray about becoming a missionary. Cambodia especially, that's the mission I support. But anywhere else, help evangelize the Christian faith. And so I always want to call everyone who watches these things, make your faith real. It's more about arguing on the internet or just taking a passing interest. Consider becoming a missionary or support the missionaries. We need people that work and have jobs and support those people as well, or be a tent maker, so to say. Become a mission, but also maintain a profession. Reflect on these things. These are the things of God. You'll save your own soul and the souls of others. My main ministry, orthodoxchristiantheology.com/donate, details therein. So let's do some audience questions. And we have some fun ones here. I'm going to try to be fair to everyone so we get everyone's perspective, but we have a nice crowd today. Nothing polemical all that much. But we have this kind of stab against the evangelicals. Galatians 6:8 has suddenly recently become my go-to passage against evangelicals. And if I were a better Christian, I'd have it memorized. But it's whoever sows to please their flesh, from the flesh will reap destruction. Whoever sows to please the Spirit, from the Spirit will reap eternal life. And I'm guessing that's an emphasis on the asceticism we read in the lives of the saints. I don't know if you guys have any comments.
I like it.
Good.
Yeah,
we have approval.
Galatians is my favorite book, and to continue our Orthodox ecumenism, I was mainly taught that by the great Father Paul Nadim Tarazi, who's another Palestinian of your tradition, who taught for over 40 years at St. Vladimir's, and before that at Balamand in Lebanon, and I think in Romania as well.
There we go. He gets around. Now this question's for, I'm guessing, Nagash is you, Deacon Enoch, right? Am I forgetting the last name or something?
No, I do that to throw my enemies off. Yeah, the legal name is different, but the literary name is H.E. Nagash in the style of C.S. Lewis, J.R. Tolkien, T.S. Eliot, H.L. Mencken, and so on and so forth.
You're confusing me, but I'll call you Deacon Enoch. So that being said, Abuna Aragawi and Abuna Gebrem Nefes Kudus are saints, and both of them from Rome and Egypt. Are they known in Eastern Orthodoxy as saints?
Yeah, so Abuna Aragawi is one of the nine Greco-Syrians we mentioned earlier, so not Rome proper, but from the Levant or Mesopotamia, or potentially Alexandria, as we were saying. And Abuna Gebrem Nefes Kudus is the one that I was saying earlier, who we say is Egyptian. So that's more a question for you two. Have you ever heard of either of these saints?
You're our resident Eastern Orthodox expert on saints.
No, they're not officially on the books, but I have no objections to adding them on.
There you go. When we got to work on Evangelos, 1, becoming celibate and never marrying, and 2, being a monk, and 3, then he become a bishop, and then maybe
I'm gonna get in trouble, Craig.
It's an easier life, believe me. That being said, ask Deacon Enoch why we venerate John of Damascus, and if he knows any other post-schism saints we venerate. I think we kind of cover that, unless there's anything else you want to add. So I'm going to say we cover that. Yeah. Be kind and rewind.
The only thing I'd say is like the 2 saints that the other person mentioned, and St. John of Damascus, as you mentioned, like none of the Christology is mentioned. It's not really like raised polemically.
And reframe that for me. I'm having a senior moment. I'm the wrong side of 40.
So you were saying how in our synaxarion, it doesn't as it obviously doesn't, it doesn't present his views on Christology, which were obviously not amenable to us.
Yes.
And I would say the same thing about Abuna Aragawi and Abuna Gebrem Nefes Kudus, or sometimes affectionately just short as Abbo. These saints don't have like long polemics against the EO, which is why I think Evangelos would be very comfortable with them, because they don't like denigrate other groups of Christians regarding Christology.
I think what's so important about the hagiographic witness, because here's the disconnect between apologetics and, I'd like to say, a more holistic Orthodox faith. And of course, people on the internet are generally just seeing apologetics and not the holistic faith you would get from living the life and attending the services. And my point would be this. They'd say, well, you have this saint and he did this and killed people, or he did this odd doctrinal thing, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But obviously what we receive from the saint is what the hagiographic witness emphasizes as important. And we see the same thing in ecumenical councils. People will zero in on, well, this letter talks about X or Y within the letter. But really what's important is, well, after they read the letter, what do they talk about as important from the letter? And that's clearly what is approved by the ecumenical council. And so as we see on the side of the Ethiopians, it would be wrong to say as a gotcha, you have St. John of Damascus as a saint, so now accept this Christology, because clearly that's not where they're coming from with it. And so it's now, of course, we'd like you to eventually do that on our side, and then we could be a big, whole, happy family. But that's not the show for this. It's just more, how do we understand the Ethiopian take on it? And I think it's just read their synaxarion. That gives a very good indication of where they're coming from and what they are venerating in any of these individuals.
It's like in our tradition, when some of us suggest, oh, you guys accept Jude as scripture. Jude quotes the book of Enoch and claims that it's written by Enoch, 7th from Adam. Therefore, you must accept the book of Enoch.
Yeah, that's a good parallel.
So there we go. We have this from Elijah. Did people in Ethiopia immediately reject the 4th council? Our view is that St. Kaleb of Axum was proposed in the early 6th century, already accepted Chalcedon. I want Deacon Enoch's take first.
Obviously, we have nothing of the sort that says that he accepted Chalcedon. It wouldn't really make sense, and there's no written evidence of that, as far as I know. You guys, if Elijah or others, my father's namesake, have that, then please send it our way. We'd be interested in examining it, but no written evidence I've ever seen of the sort. This immediacy thing, it's the great Greek word ephthes, which you see a lot in the Gospel of Mark, by the way. If you see immediately, you don't see that in the church history of Ethiopia. As I said, we're under the purview of the Copts that time. We had in the 4th century the Metropolitan St Frumentius, who was Abba Salama, and others who would represent us from Alexandria. And so by virtue of that, we kind of on paper automatically reject the Fourth Council. But I think a lot of Craig's point is like, in fact, are we rejecting it? I don't think so. Like we said, I think there's a lot of interaction for centuries, especially when you talk about things like the Henoticon, which we didn't mention, and other documents that try to bring people back together.
So I want to emphasize, people, you could have been totally fine with the vast majority of the, I'll just say, the Mediterranean church, right? The world's global church, and not have at that time, for rightly or wrongly, so I'm not going to take a stance on this, historically accepting Chalcedon explicitly, because this was the era of the Henoticon. And even at this time, Rome, for half its popes, were in communion with bodies that were in communion with people that did not explicitly accept Chalcedon. Now, this is not ultimately where most of those Mediterranean churches went, but during the reign of King Kaleb, this was still something that would have been relevant. And so that's something I just want to draw out here, because we think of these binaries, which the reality on the ground during that actual time would have not really been applicable in the same way it may be applicable today. So that's my comments. I don't know if Evangelos wants to add anything.
The closest historical note we have, I have it in the intro, is when Emperor Justinian, he sent a letter to King Kaleb to fight the Persians, and he said he appealed to him on the grounds of their, quote, shared faith or shared confession, in Greek, totis doxis omognomon, meaning like they were of the same mind in terms of faith, which could just be, a diplomatic phrase, but at least, it shows that Emperor Justinian perceived this person as part of his orbit, or his Christian communion, broadly construed, and as an ally against a foreign enemy.
Very, very good that you brought that up. Now we have this comment: nicely, Eastern Orthodox and Oriental Orthodox getting along. I'm new to all this, but the difference seems to be a lot smaller than some people claim. I'm guessing he's referring to Christology, but we're 2 hours in, more than 2 hours in. We're not going to get into that topic now. So we're going to leave that aside, but that's your comment. We have this. I think it's similar. The difference between Eastern Orthodox and Oriental Orthodox is limited to Chalcedon, specifically in Christology, but it created big havoc among each other. And simply, again, I'm just letting people have relevant comments up. I'm not going to comment on it unless there's a fire in your belly. You guys, I'm willing to leave it aside.
Yeah, a brief fire. I don't want to talk about the Christology.
All right, brief fire. Deacon, you are a guest by all means. Go right ahead.
To your point of St. John Damascus, we never had, especially around the time that you guys had, this group of iconoclasts, and especially no iconoclasts with any real power. Yeah. And so when you look at the Oriental Orthodox communion, we all have icons, but we have less of them. And so, like you said, we look at St. John Damascus and those parts of your later ecumenical councils that don't have to do with the Christology, like the promotion of icons. We're like, hey, yeah, that's great stuff. We never had a need to have a council about that. And we never had any like written official regulations on it. But it's a great example to the ancient witness of the church that even after these divisions, whether de jure or de facto, we still had common beliefs on icons. And where like our great monasteries in Egypt and like in Ethiopia and Waldeba and Mount Athos, sometimes you find more rigorous people theologically, doctrinally, apologetics wise in those places. I think if you look at, like you mentioned, Craig, the life of these monks, like how they live their life in fasting, in prayer, in almsgiving, with icons, with liturgy, that's a cappella, I think overwhelmingly we see the vast similarities. And it's a testament to God that we were able to present these things, even like the unaltered Nicene Constantinopolitan Creed over this great amount of time that, of course, the Roman Church altered with the Philoque, like, and we don't have to argue that, but like just the fact that we have all these things still in common to this day is an incredible witness to God, I think.
I think that in reference, I think the second point is correct, and I'm not polemical on this issue. All I could say is I give glory to God for any conversion to Christianity among the pagans. I don't care, it's Protestant, whatever. They're better off as some sort of Christian than what they were before. And so the closer we are, the better. And so I give thanks that a lot of the ethos between the Oriental and Eastern Orthodox communions is very close, because ultimately this will make bridging the gap much easier, because a real reconciliation ultimately will have to be based on shared ethos, shared doctrine. And obviously when those things are farther apart, that's harder to get there. That being said, the former point is like with icons, though we could find in some of the ancient churches, I would say churches that are sleeved with icons all over the place, generally speaking, they weren't. There'd be less. I think this is when we had more relics. So you wouldn't want to distract from the relics front and center. So obviously when there is this iconoclastic controversy within the Constantinopolitan sphere, and then they could finally have icons, it's almost like being this repressed teenager that gets to leave the house and they embrace everything. It's like, oh, I'm having icons all over the place. My parents didn't let me have a tattoo. I'm going to have this dragon spiraling all the way up to my shoulder and all that crazy stuff. So it's in a good way with icons what happens with us, because I actually kind of like the sleeved church, the icons going up to the ceiling. It's beautiful. But I don't want people to be surprised. That's not something you would see everywhere, particularly outside of Eastern Orthodoxy at this point, or even like in the Hagia Sophia and stuff like that. That church wasn't laid out that way because it precedes really a lot of the iconoclastic stuff.
There were mosaics, but it wasn't, for example, the templon of the church wasn't what we'd later associate with like a post-Byzantine or Russian full templon with icons.
So we have, why should we care about this topic? And the short answer is because we share saints. Here's a question, Deacon Henok. Do Ethiopian censers have bells?
I don't know if they're, I guess they jingle. Yeah, I would say they do.
There we go. They got bells too. Smells and bells just like we got.
More smoke.
Even though St Frumentius was a young man when he came to Ethiopia, he still was old enough to assist in governance. Is that correct? Like he was like a teenager or something?
Yeah, he was like, I think he was older than Izana, but obviously younger than the reigning king. And so he's like a mentor or a pedagogue to the princes.
All right. So we got this. You guys think St. Jared will ever become a saint from a Catholic Eastern Orthodox Evangelos?
Well, I think it would depend officially on open communion, but I think as we've discussed, there's nothing objectionable in having a private devotion or just learning from the life of the saint from this tradition, given how close the churches were at that point.
I would add briefly on that point because it says RC and EO. The EO, I think it's probably harder to do it this late in the stage, but the RC could kind of
they can embrace everybody.
Yeah, they could do whatever they want. Pope Francis, who we're remembering right now, he did two things like this. First, he added Saint Gregory of Narek, and he didn't just add him as a saint,
right?
Yeah, and he made
the church,
and he made him a doctor of the church, exactly. And he has a commentary in Song of Songs and a type of psalm-like book as well. And the more recent thing he did as well was the 21 Coptic martyrs of Libya, which Jonathan Rumi, who's EO, by the way, by birth, because his father's EO from Alexandria, but his mother was Irish Catholic. And he, in his adulthood, became Catholic. He plays Jesus on Chosen. He's the executive producer of these Coptic martyrs who were added to the Roman martyrology by Pope Francis as well.
Yeah, that can't help but ultimately make like ecumenism more integral to at least their belief system, because I can't see how else you could do that. But be that as it may, we'll move on to this question. Does Ethiopian Christianity trace its roots back to Queen Sheba, or the eunuch, or the nine saints? Deacon Enoch's previous interviews have inspired me to do a lot of research on this. So any quick take on this, Deacon Enoch?
Yes. So let's go plug some more great EO people. My friend Richard Rowland, aka Subdeacon Seraphim, soon to be elevated to Deacon Seraphim in Dallas. I visited him early this year, and the head of Ancient Faith Ministries, Father Stephen Andrew Damick, who I also met at the time. They have a new show on Old Tales, and they've been covering recently, I think in 2 parts, what's called the Kibra Nagast, or the Glory of Kings. And it's this document from at least the 1200s with sources within it that might go back to the 4th or 5th century. And it is like the classic state propaganda of our wonderful Ethiopian empire. And in that telling of the story, it goes back, yes, to the Queen of Sheba, and it talks about this unbroken line of Judaism in Ethiopia. The written record and other archaeological evidence doesn't support this as much. And so that's why, it's like when I was a kid, I believed. When I got older, I stopped believing. But then with recent DNA studies, I started believing again. With the
So is this like that meme where it's like the retards think this, then the normies like, nah, and then it goes to the geniuses, it goes back
the
to
super high IQ move, yes, and the other word I won't say, move, agree that the midwits don't, that Ethiopians are actually Jews, or even another way, more neutrally to say it, in addition to we was kings, we was Palestinians. And so when I did my own DNA, 55%, which is like the overwhelming percent of my DNA, comes from Palestine, or the Levant, however you want to call it, from the New Stone Age and from around the time of the Bronze Age collapse. And it's about 45% of my DNA that's East African. And so we are a hybrid people. I think that's what that legend or story, the main truth from it is that Ethiopians, Aksumites specifically, Habasha, are a hybridized people of Near East and East Africa. Exactly what those things are hard to determine. The DNA tests say they're Natufian-like, which is the New Stone Age, or thousands of years ago Palestinians, not laying any claims to the current conflict, mixed with the Eastern African hunter-gatherers. Like, that's who we are, and that's what that fundamental story of Queen Sheba, which is in scripture and in the Kibra Nagast, mating with, outside of marriage, King Solomon, bringing back
so it's almost a myth that speaks to a genetic and historical truth.
Absolutely. And it gets into the Ark of the Covenant story as well.
All right. So we have this. I don't know enough about Ethiopian history, but the claim, this is coincidentally the day the communist regime was toppled. So that's true. That's pretty neat. We got this. I'm sorry to say this, but that doesn't sound like genuine conversion. There's Coptic Church and other Oriental Orthodox churches to appeal to. So I just wanted, hey, that's that guy's comment. We have, thank you for documenting, contributing to the saints of Ethiopia. Appreciated. So thank you, Evangelos. Here's my favorite comment. The tariffs caused the schism. Stay woke. So there we go. Here's one. Could he explain Psalm 137:9 that says, "The bash infants against the rocks"? And I would say pretty universally in the patristic interpretations of verse like this, the infants are typologically the passions. So what we're doing is we're fighting the passions, and we take the kingdom of heaven by force. So like this happens in the lives of saints, where their asceticism borders on aggressive, like we were talking about Saint Moses the Black, where he took those energies where he used as a bandit, and he used this towards his asceticism, almost ruthlessly so, to the point of destroying his health, like when he was gathering the water and provisions for the other ascetics. And so this very aggressive warlike language in the Old Testament is calling us to this. And that's how it's always been interpreted in the patristics I've read. I don't know if you guys have any comments on that.
I think that sounds right.
There we go. All right. I got 2 wins today. Pretty sure Ethiopia officially became Miaphysite in the 11th and 12th centuries. So that's that one historical take. We have no explanation why. So there we go. Baldwin IV says, are there connections and theological discussions between the Russian church and Ethiopian one? I know that some sort of discussion exists in the Armenian and the Russian churches. So, Deacon, I see you nodding. Do you have any background on this? I only know when I read the news, it just seems to be between those two countries, there's a lot of actual diplomatic and economic cooperation. And so parallel with this has to do with the neo-Sergianism issue in Russia is also theological discourse. So I don't know what you have to add to that. If you could give us some more information, Deacon.
There have been some Russian theologian individuals who seem like they want the reunion the least amount. However, when it comes to the highest level of the patriarch and the holy synods and the people being sent, Ethiopia and Russia have this amazing history that goes back to the empires. So the pre-communist period, the empires were talking to each other. There's a great guy who would be today an ethnic Ukrainian, but obviously was a part of the Russian Empire, called Alexander Bulatovich. And he has this great writing and talks about his days right in the 1890s. After Ethiopia defeated Italy for the first time in the first invasion, he came to the aid of the Ethiopians, unlike a lot of other European powers, rather than the Italians. And he saw, because of Orthodox Christianity, even though there were obviously divisions over Chalcedon, he saw greater affinity with the Ethiopians than he did with the Italians, who were Catholic. And he came to the aid with the Red Cross of the Ethiopians. And he later, by the way, died in a weird controversy about, I think, the holy name of God and the Our Father, defending the monks of Mount Athos. He had an amazing life, this guy, Bulatovich. But then Russia becomes communist in 1917, right? Ethiopia becomes communist in the 70s. And so during the communist period of Ethiopia in the 70s,
you're getting bad stuff
80s,
from Russia too.
Bad stuff from, both bad and good. There was a connection again. So there was a connection during the empire. Then there was a connection again during the communist period. And then now both countries are again forging like this new identity. And so very often, like you said, there are a lot of Russian privateers, like you saw the one privateer who made a move on Putin and was put down, but active in Russia, but also the official government regime is very active. They have some Navy troops that they've been training in Eritrea, which obviously used to be a part of Ethiopia. And so there are a lot of relations between the government of Russia and the government of Ethiopia, but also the two churches of Russia and Ethiopia. Where it leads, nobody knows.
Yeah, it's and the same is true with the Nestorians in Iran, and of course the government of Iran and Russia. So a lot of this runs parallel political aspirations. The same was true in pre-imperial Russia, because obviously Ethiopia would have been south of the Turks. Ethiopia, right, would have been in opposition to Italy, and a lot of these competing. And Russia would have wanted access, obviously, to the Mediterranean Sea, where both Italy and the Turks would have been opposed to them. So we have a lot of this, and we see this in ancient first millennium church history as well, that a lot of these geopolitical things are providential for matters in the church. And so we can only hope that on the basis of true doctrine and on fidelity to the Orthodox faith, that there will be reconciliation. And for the sake of being diplomatic, this in the way that it needs to take for that to be correct, which one of our sides got to be wrong to some extent. But I won't give an opinion on that.
One quick thing to add about how that looks is on the Feast of the Holy Cross, which is in September, and then I think on Christmas and Pascha, especially the past few years, we've invited choirs of Russian Orthodox in their clergy, in their cassocks, and they would sing their old church Slavonic hymns at our feast celebrations. So obviously no Eucharist yet, but singing hymns is seen as something that is acceptable between the two parties.
All right. And someone said like BRICS. So yes, because a lot of this is like I think the new phrase now is the global South, but there's an alignment of these economic and geopolitical spheres, and Ethiopia seems to be closer to Russia historically than the West. 1 second, I'm a boomer of technology, so I'm losing stuff. Did you find gentlemen discuss about when the Ethiopian church stops being Eastern Orthodox communion? And no, we kind of lay that aside because it's pretty unclear. But if you rewind We do get into details of the potential for sporadic communion and what that means and what it doesn't mean, perhaps. We have a random dude here. Do all Christians need to reach high levels of historical and theological knowledge and understanding, or do we all have different specializations in the body of Christ? Deacon.
I would say the latter. A great conversation to check out regarding that is Redeemed Zoomer and my friend Deacon Meret Malaku, who very famously got on the apologetics world stage by owning Stewart and Cliff at MIT. And he's a Harvard student of neurobiology and a deacon in the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, and grew up at the same parish in Los Angeles that I did. And in their conversation, they talk about how, for example, if you have the grandma in a rural area, she's not a theologian and she's not expected to have these things. And we talked about this with the role of men and women, and especially the beautiful role women have in nurturing children. Remember that St. Timothy of Ephesus, who was a bishop, was in scripture recognized by St. Paul to have learned the faith from his mother and his grandmother, from Lois and Eunice. And so there are many different roles that people have in the church. And yeah, you don't all need to be theologians. And I myself don't consider myself a theologian. I'm a mere homilist.
I think it's the mass education of people has been very spiritually hazardous, because we interact with faith in too intellectual and detached a way. And really what I'm doing mostly, like what people know me for, though I do have that commentary in Job up there, please know me for that as well. But it's this intellectual interaction of the faith, which has a purpose, but I feel it's to call people out of it, right? It's almost Morpheus in the Matrix, calling people out of the Matrix. We want to call people into the life of the church. And that's where I think what Evangelos is doing really is so important with the saints' lives, because that's really should be most of our interaction with the faith, should be living out the faith, the doing of good works, the giving of alms, devotional practices. Reading the saints is a devotional practice. And this is really what is important, because I think despite your knowledge level, you ought to be giving alms and doing your prayers. And we're now mostly literate, even the not so intelligent, us reading some of the scriptures, lives of the saints. And when people weren't literate, they would have got this in church or during pilgrimages if they went to monasteries or whatever. And so, I mean, this is really what God's calling us to, this life of faith, and not necessarily to be history experts. I think there's an anxiety, and I'd be interested in your guys' comments before we close. There's an anxiety, again, in the West, because we're so intellectual, like, am I choosing the wrong church, right? This is maybe not something you grew up Greek or grew up Ethiopian is all that relevant. Like, you might, as you get older, like, because again, we're all educated in the West, you start like, all right, I need some sort of intellectual defense for what I am, but what you are is already established, right? For other people, their approach to faith has always been intellectual. And so this becomes almost an existential crisis. And again, existentialism is an anachronism that's far past the origins of Christianity. So I think that's the anxiety this commenter is speaking to. I don't know if you guys have any comments.
Well, Christianity it's the faith of the fishermen, right? So we praise the fact that God appeared in a humble form. He didn't come as a powerful king to convert the high priest. He appealed to the simple people. And I think if you approach the faith with that simple heart, that will also enlighten your mind. And I think that's why in the history of the church, you see that it's often the monastics who have the greatest Christian ethos and practice, who are the first to come to the aid of the church when there were heresies that spread. And by the same token, it's often the most educated and the most philosophically literate people who often, like Arius, fell into these heresies. So the approaching the faith with simplicity of heart and humility is paramount, and then the rest really just flowers off of that and builds off of that.
Deacon?
I think that was well said. And there's this we'll beat up on the evangelicals, like evangelical hatred of monks, and even the secular evolutionary biologists are like, oh, you're an evolutionary dead end and all these things. But what they don't understand is when we say memory eternal, it's for reasons like this, because it is the Benedictine monks in the Latin tradition who were heavily influenced by the Near East who revived Europe and the West as you know it. And the same could be said about the Greek monks and the Syriac monks and the Coptic monks and the Ge'ez monks. And it's from this tradition that they get to live forever, not only in heaven with the Lord, but even here on earth, they get to live forever through their writings. And so may their blessings be with us all.
Well, we've already been doing this for more 2 hours and a half. Both your contributions are very much appreciated. I am very grateful for your time today. Evangelos, Deacon Henok, always a pleasure. So great to be able to collaborate on this issue of the lives of the Ethiopian saints.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
So I will end this show as I end all of them by quoting Jesus the Rock, fight to death for the truth. The Lord God will fight for you. God bless you. Have a great day.